I'm live. Okay, let me lower this and keep this up. Hi, everybody. Just the sound of my cat. I don't know what she's doing over there. Girl, I'm trying to stream. Why are you cleaning your butt on the other side of the monitor? Go on the floor to do that. You're dirty. You're dirty. Feel shame. Yeah, go. Thank you. Sorry about that. Hi, I'm Rachel, and welcome to my vampire-themed book club. It's a Sunday night thing, and 6 p.m., obviously, Eastern Standard Time, and we read vampire short stories here, and occasionally books, but books are more of a side project. I am over-explaining. Welcome to my vampire book club. So, we are finally finishing off the Mammoth book of vampire stories by women, edited by Stephen Jones. There's 35 stories when you include the introduction. We are on 33, 34, and then the 35th is a poem. It's going to be a long reading tonight if this isn't your first time here, you're returning. Heads up. They're not typically this long page count wise because I don't really like going over 2 hours. But because it's the last 3 stories, the first one is like a normal short story length, but the second one is pretty long, at least for this channel. Not like your eyeballs or something. I don't know what you like to read. So yeah, strap in, expect to be here for a while. I expect to be here for a while because I'm gonna finish this frickin' book tonight. Okay, first story is A North Light by Gweneth Jones. And every story starts with a little blurb from the author, which includes a quote. Maybe every writer... Hold on, let me move some stuff so you can hear me a little better. Just realized I usually move the mic a little bit closer because I don't need my keyboard. Come here. Hi. Oh no. I'm jostling everything. Oh no. Okay. Maybe every writer of fantasy fiction has a vampire story in them, says Jones. This is my second foray. My teenage vampire story, The Fear Man by Anne Hallam, won the Dracula Society's Children of the Night Award in 1995, but that was a pro-vampire version in which the Children of the Night were aliens among us, and some of them at least were capable of virtue. North Light takes a harsher view. It's sort of a modern version of the J. Sheridan Le Fanu story Carmilla. Note the coincidence in names. And treats of the vampire as tourist and tourist as vampire. I think there's a lot to be said for the analogy. But from personal experience, I am convinced that there are bed and breakfast landladies in Erin's Green Isle and elsewhere who would be the match for any sophisticated undead bloodsucker. Poor Camilla. Redemption is such a humiliating fate. I just remembered. I like to read these ahead of time so that I can at least work on getting the words I can't say. Like a little pronunciation on the side to look at real quick while I'm reading to help me so I don't completely screw up the reading. I did those little notes, but then I never went in and actually told myself how to say them. Oh no! I'm so sorry for ruining the last 3 stories. Oh no. Oh god, this is going to be a nightmare. Okay. A carefree traveler's life is full of evenings like this one. You have the money, you have the looks, you have the style, you even have what used to be called the letters of introduction in the old days. Yet still you find yourself winding along the disturbingly narrow lanes, vivid green pasture on either side, a voluptuous sunset overhead, and nowhere to spend the night. The grass, growing in a stiff Mohican strip down the middle of the asphalt, confesses that this is a route only used by those high-slung, soot-belching, infuriating tractors. The desk staff at the quaint, old-world, but surprisingly expensive, little inn that just turned you away, with the offensive smugness of a fully booked hostelry in high-season hostelry. Hostelry. In high season. I've obviously sent you on a wild goose chase. Never again, you say to yourself, but the lure of an open road will prevail. Wanderlust. My God, here it is, breathed Camilla. The house stood foursquare and somewhat sinister in its bulk of yellow stone, at the top of one of those endless rank pastures. No trace of a garden, except for a bizarrely suburban matriculation of cypress hedge. My God. Matriculation of cypress hedge. The gates at the road announced the services of Jonas O'Driscoll, builder. Also vacancies, but vacancies cannot be trusted. Should be okay, said Sheridan, scanning the whereabouts and liking the isolation. It's freaking huge for a B&B. Unreal. Not at all, she corrected him. Camilla was always wise to the local ways. Traditional Irish rural industry needs bedrooms. The only crop that thrives in this country is babies. Breed them up for emigration, ship them out, and look forward to a comfortable retirement on their earnings. That's cold-blooded, isn't it? She laughed. I like it. It shows a fine ruthlessness. Children as a business venture. Why not? She was childless herself. Bring me tangle-curled, barefoot peasant girls, groaned Sheridan. Bring me a reeking cottage with a pig looking out. Mine hostess was at the door, a young woman with mouse brown hair cropped short as a boy's, her large behind embraced in boyish dark blue jeans, pink cheeks, naive round hazel eyes, and a cute piggy turned-up nose. The tourists smothered their giggles as she welcomed them into a stark tiled hallway with a huge varnished pine dresser and varnished pine umbrella stand. Poker work signs hung on the walls, inscribed with the rules of the B&B, all credit cards, rooms must be vacated, etc. Miniature warming pans, decorative tea cloths, china donkeys on a knick-knack shelf, everything excruciatingly new. The travelers caught each other's eyes and sighed. Their hostess was Noreen O'Driscoll. She'd had a phone call from the inn, and she could show them to an ensuite room. She beamed naively when they accepted the astonishing price of a night's lodging, displayed flushed puzzlement when they insisted on shaking hands. Camilla and Sheridan liked to shake hands with the natives. They followed her round denim bottom up the varnished pine stairs, savoring the touch of that scrubbed peasant skin, already worn down. She can't be more than 25 or so, poor girl, to the texture of spongy sandpaper. Room number 5, ensuite. How many rooms are there? Maybe 6, maybe 8. Maybe it goes on forever into the antechambers of hell. Thick, yellowy, varnished pine, brass number plates. The wallpaper in number 4 is the same as in the stairwell. Strawberries and strawberry flowers in shades of pastel brown and pastel apricot. The bed takes up most of the space. The bedding is pastel apricot. Polly something, with the same debased, dreary strawberries and strawberry flowers. There's a fitted wardrobe, a vanity unit. A window with meager, flimsy curtains provides a magnificent sea view. As they stare at the room, Noreen frankly stares at them, those two exotic birds of passage. Tall and slender, blonde and sophisticated. He is tall. She is blonde. Her round, bright eyes are filled with a peasant's ingenious hunger for sensation. Ingenuous hunger for sensation. This is fine, says Sheridan briskly. We'll take it. Noreen looks at Cam, a little puzzled. Camilla must remind Cher that he's in a country where menfolk do not make domestic decisions. It's his place to be silent. But she also looks very happy. They are welcome. They are accepted. They are fascinating. All is as it should be. When they were alone, Camilla sniffed the towels and moaned softly. The polyester sheets, cheap enough to start with, are worn to a grisly fungoid sheen. And why in the world, in a house so big, does this double room have to be so mean and cramped? It's a battery cage for tourists. I can't stand these places, muttered Camilla. I cannot bear them. The sheer effrontery. I thought Ireland was supposed to be romantic. That's my line, said Sheridan. He has to stoop a little to look out of the window. Beyond the pasture, a wide sea shore under a fabulous sweep of sky, but the back of a house is like a builder's yard, a heap of sand under tarpaulin, a stack of roof tiles. The children are playing, 2 boys of that touching age between childhood and adolescence, trying to humiliate each other with BMX bike tricks. A girl a little older, chivying a terrier puppy, a couple of infants unseen above. He smiled on them benignly. The light is wonderful. She could hear the children's voices. How can you tell? It's nearly dark. Exactly. I'm doing something. He turned with a knowing grin. I'm sure you'll find something to do. There's still a bite in my face. Move a little. Star of the show. Camilla went on grumbling. Don't you dare get on the computer, you little shithead. Thank you. Calm down, okay? We have time. Camilla went on grumbling as they carried up their bags, unpacked, and made futile efforts to render the battery cage habitable. Oh, wait. Did I finish that sentence? Hold on. Exactly, he turned with a knowing grin. I'm sure you'll find something to do. Camilla went on grumbling as they carried up their bags, unpacked, and made futile efforts to render the battery cage habitable. But when they ventured into the lower regions in search of advice about an evening meal, she was the one who accepted the offer of a cup of tea, condemning them to a tete-a-tete with Noreen in the guest lounge and TV room. Mine hostess brought tea and fairy cakes, 1 per guest. Later, she brought the baby, 8-month-old Roisin. Suffering, I don't know how to say that clearly. Suffering from the colic. Told Camilla the names of her other children, confided the state of her husband's business. Camilla tasted the admiration in Noreen's eyes and drew more of it to herself, insensately. Out of habit, like a pianist running over her scales, she couldn't help it. She really meant no harm. Why are you dressed as a boy, she wondered. Wouldn't you be more comfortable in a nice print frock and an apron? Thus the wheel of fashion turns, and it gets harder and harder to find the true wilderness experience. Peasants the world over have Coca-Cola and internet access, but their lives, sadly enough, agreeably enough, are no less empty. An attractive stranger is still fascinating, same as she ever was. Noreen jigged the grizzling baby with businesslike indifference. Camilla admired the family photographs, Noreen in a huge white dress that would have looked better on a pickup truck, clasping her red-faced builder to her side. Sheridan sat there in his black biker jacket and his black jeans, one long leg crossed over the other, saying little, grinning secretly. Jesus, remarked Noreen in astonishment. It seems like we've been friends forever. And will you look at the time? Jonas will be home and no dinner cooked. They went out to eat at a roadhouse with pretensions, Noreen exhorting them from the doorstep to be careful of the drunk driving. In the morning, Camilla declined to rise for the full Irish breakfast. Folded between sickly polyester surfaces, the smell of bad laundry in her nostrils, she listened to middle-aged Americans tramping heavily down the stairs. She could tell by the sound of their voices that there was nothing worth getting up for in that dining room. I won't stay another night, she thought. I won't. A quarter hour later, a tap on the door, Noreen with a tray of tea and wheaten bread. Are yez poorly? Asked the young housewife, gravely concerned. He says I'm to tell you he's gone out to take a look around the possibilities. He says you'll know what he means. Sheridan's a photographer, said Camilla. He loves the light here. How nice of you to bring me the tea. You shouldn't have. I'm so sorry to be a nuisance. So Noreen stayed and talked and stayed and told terrible stories about rude, unreasonable tourists. Camilla, having deftly established that she and Sheridan were actually neither English nor American. Downstairs, baby Roisin's grizzling rose to a roar. I don't do the Irish thing very well. Camilla heard her, but Noreen didn't. When she left at last, her round eyes were as bright as stars, and she turned at the door for a lingering glance. Came back and patted Camilla's toned and slender forearm with shy, blundering tenderness. You have a good lion, Camilla. You'll be all right as rain. It's so simple, so harmless, such a breeze to elicit the kindness of strangers. The wheaten bread, poisonously tainted with an overdose of soda, was crumbled, uneaten. Camilla sat up in bed, licking her lips and smiling. She negotiated the battery cage to reach the tiny ensuite and crouched on the edge of the bath that doubled for a shower stall, which was the only way to get a good look in the mirror above the basin. "I'm not a bad person," she murmured. "Whatever possesses anyone to build a bathroom with a light from the north? An unkind light, clear and shadowless, that picks out every tiny pore. But this is not a luxury hotel. An Irish B&B is not designed to coddle the guest's sensitive amour propre. Passing trade, never passing this way again. Too much attention to detail would not be cost-effective. A fine ruthlessness," thought Camilla indulgently, as she applied her makeup. She could afford to be indulgent. She was feeling much better, all the draining little experiences of yesterday soothed. Outdoors, in the clear light that had painted a disquieting picture on Camilla's mirror, Sheridan walked around the shore of the sea loch. Making a big guess on that one. On how to say it, sorry. He stopped on a rocky outcrop above the water and sat cross-legged, taking camera lenses out of his bag. A boy of 12 or 13 came sailing along on a bicycle. The tall man had seen the boy coming from a long way off. Without appearing to do so, he was displaying his wares. The bike swerved to a halt, leaving an impressive skid mark on the gravel track. Sheridan grinned at the sound and went on thoughtfully, laying out his big black truncheons of lenses, his electronic light meters, his tripod. Here comes the boy, the last late beauty of childhood wrecked by a bullet-headed haircut, magnetically attracted to the stranger, a dignified scowl on his face. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to take some pictures." The boy comes closer. Sheridan is an adult, and therefore of no account, but he's dressed like a big teenager, and big teenagers are gods. "There's seals in the loch, but yez won't see them. Sheridan shrugged, indifferent to the kind of wildlife that most tourists pursue. "There are seals in the zoo. I'll take pictures of the light in the water." He grinned as the boy came closer still. "Maybe I'll take pictures of you." Sheridan drove an ancient Bentley, 1940s vintage, British racing green, a fabulous monster. The car suffered some kind of mechanical failure. It had to be nursed to the town beyond the pretentious roadhouse and left there for diagnosis and treatment. Camilla was not exactly ill, but she was tired out by weeks of travel. She took to her bed in number 4 and soon had Noreen waiting on her hand and foot. The passing trade of heavy Americans would have been astonished at this unheard-of behavior, but they never heard anything about it. Short shrift, in and out, was Noreen's usual way. Her conversation was all reserved for the beautiful stranger. She was in and out of number 4 all day, sometimes jigging baby Roisin on her arm, very concerned at Camilla's bird-like appetite. "Sure yez don't eat enough to keep a sparrow alive," she sighed, stroking back Camilla's lovely blonde hair. A little physical intimacy had become natural. A touch here, an arm around the shoulders there, nothing shocking, just like sisters. "I'm eating very well," protested Camilla with a gentle smile. "You look after me wonderfully." The mirror and that apology for a bathroom obstinately showed a face more worn and wan than Camilla liked to see, but it was deceptive. She had been at a low ebb, running on empty. She was feeling stronger every day. "Is the photography a living, then?" asked Noreen, curiously, lifting a tray with a soup bowl that had barely been tasted, glancing admirably at the food refused, that mark of true sophistication. Roisin was on her arm in a sick-stained pajama suit. I feel bad for the kid. I bet it's like, if you say it right, it's all really pretty. The name, I mean. "Oh, yes, a very good living. And you?" Camilla said she didn't have a job. She didn't need one. "So you're like a kept woman?" said Noreen, round-eyed. "Jesus, I couldn't do that. I'd be afraid to do that." Slightly needled, Camilla laughed. "Oh, no. What I mean is we work together. He takes the pictures. I write the text. We make beautiful books. Neither of them needs a job. They are financially independent, but it's better not to say so. And it's very true that Sheridan makes a living for himself out of his photography. Very true." Thumps and yells from downstairs. The children are indoors. There's a bug going around, which has robbed the oldest boy of his playmates, so he's at home watching television. The girl has stayed in too for some reason, and therefore also the younger mites. I hope to God they don't get sick, mutters Noreen bitterly. It would be like their awkwardness in August, when I have me hands full with the plaguey tourists. Camilla murmurs something apologetic, but no, Noreen won't hear a word. No, she's loving having Camilla here. Looking after Camilla is like a big treat, like going to the pictures, like going to the hairdresser, she adds dreamily, and sitting there reading a magazine, the height of Noreen's motions of idle splendor. Gonna take a break for a drink. Gotta take care of my voice. There's like so much left to read. Sheridan takes a walk in the lichen-gnarled oak wood by the shore in the company of a 10-year-old girl, not the daughter of the B&B, another little girl. He shows her things that she has never known and tells her the names of flowers and trees which have merely been flowers, trees, to the barren little mind of the modern peasant. Here's a wood ant's nest, a treacle-brown heap of sifted soil that looks like a small grave, but when you take a second glance, the grave is heaving. Did you know, says Sheridan, that ants are farmers? They lie down together, the tall man and the little girl and the leaf litter, and watch an ant shepherd teasing a drop of nectar from the pointed belly of one of its aphid charges. Aphid? I know the word. It's the little critters. Holy Jesus God, says the little girl. It's like a science fiction film. The weak are here to justify the strong, says Sheridan, stroking a drop from another insect with a pointed grass blade to show how easy it is to milk this crop. Jesus, says the little girl, peering intently. If they were bigger, it would be like a horror movie. She sighed. Yez knows a lot. It's like talking to the internet. Shall I take your picture now? The little girl thinks maybe she ought to run, but she doesn't. Camilla and Noreen walk by the shore, Noreen pushing a stoutly built tartan-upholstered buggy ahead of her. It's what passes for a fine summer day on the west coast of Ireland. There are cars ranked in the car park, battalions of windbreaks, very few foreign tourists. Camilla's thinking of her glimpses of native life before this provincial halt. I don't know. Shovel-faced young woman marching along lanes where only tractors and tourists ply, with the baby in the buggy, and you wonder, where is she going? You wonder what kind of life it is she leads. You want to touch her. Now Camilla is in the picture. She has penetrated to the heart of the alien world. It's always a thrill, however often repeated. She has seen Noreen's husband briefly, a kitchen monster, sitting at the table, knife and fork in either fist, red and passive slab of a face. My God, to lie under that, while it silently prods children into you. But she keeps such thoughts to herself, tucks her arm in Noreen's arm, and recounts her adventures as a world traveler, long-haul traveler. The pyramids of Giza, the restaurants of New York, wise insights. And is it Giza or Giza? Oh no. Wise insights. In West Africa, in the market of Fumban, beside the earth-walled palace of the sultans. Did you know you will only find Dutch printed cotton? Is that a fact? Would there not be any native handicrafts there? Noreen, it's a big lie that the colonial powers went to Africa and Asia to plunder the natural resources. That wasn't afterthought. They went to force new markets for their goods, to sell, not to buy. It's the same with tourists. Did you ever think of that? They don't come to see, they come to be looked at. Did you ever think of that? I did not, said Noreen, blinking in bewilderment. Oh, but I could never call you a tourist, Cam. You're much more than that to me. Shyly, she clasped Camilla's arm to her well-nourished flank. The pleasure lies in knowing that it will go no further. There will be no consequences, because Camilla isn't staying. Tastes and smells, moments of intensity, never a bill presented. They walked on, Noreen silenced for a little by her own outburst. You know, she said after a moment or two, I'm worried about this bug that's going around. Some folk are keeping the children in. Do you think I should keep them indoors? Them? The kids. Ah, Camilla frowned and looked away. Don't worry, your kids are safe. She didn't explain the emphasis. Not sure I did good enough at that. Your kids are safe. No, and then the whole sentence was emphasized. Crap. Your kids are safe. The steel blue waves rushed in and out. The mothers sat behind the windbreaks. A somewhat depleted cohort of local boys and girls jumped and splashed in the water. I suppose all your children are grown up and gone, sighed Noreen, shoving the buggy over recalcitrant tide rack, and compounded this faux pas by adding hurriedly, "Ugh, I meant you must have been married very young." Married? Camilla dispelled the idea with a laugh, slightly put out that her dark hint has been ignored. Sheridan and I have been together so long, we're almost like brother and sister, but we've never been, officially married. Not married, gulped Noreen. I've never been married. I like my independence. But you said you was like a kept woman? That was my joke. We're finding the, are they together? Are they a couple? Or are they siblings? Very ahead of its time. Should have started the Instagram page. Gweneth Jones. Sorry, that was stupid. Never married. The buggy gave a jolt that made Royson wail. Among the family portraits so readily on display in the guest lounge and TV room, there are several women who have never married, holding ugly babies against their bolster chests. Noreen's astonished gaze is comparing Camilla with those cruel working great aunts, finding a place for her among the failed huntresses, old maids. You look so young, she gasped, as if unmarried bliss was in her mind inextricably linked with spinster middle age. You look like a fashion model. Camilla squeezed the housewife's arm more tightly and leaned close to rub her cool, pale cheek against Noreen's warm, rosy one. I've been young for so long, she murmured. I can't remember being anything else. Ah, sighed Noreen. For 2 pins, I'd... What would she do? Take Camilla away from all this? The blushing plowboy, the sophisticated older woman. The configurations are endless, and pity may play a part. It's all grist to Camilla's mill. It's like a transfusion of fresh blood, without any of those ugly, depressing emergency room details. Love is the hunger on which we feed. Damn. Okay. Just throwing that. That was a good sentence. Sheridan prowled the woods and the shore. Camilla, no longer poorly, haunted the kitchens of the B&B, where Noreen was penned for most of her life, incessantly cooking, stowing the washing machine, ironing dank sheets. Noreen relayed the tales of the disastrous epidemic, the boy with the nightmares, and no one in that house gets a wink of sleep. The girl that they rushed to the hospital, but then the doctors couldn't find anything wrong. So that was a whole day gone for nothing, with the driving her there, and the waiting in the waiting room, and the driving her back. In August, too. Jesus God. Schadenfreude. Noreen is miraculously preserved. Camilla changes the subject. We are all kept women, she says. Noreen has confided that romance is long out of the window with her Jonas. We can't do without them, can we? We may look like the perfect couple, but the truth is, there are things she breaks off, and will say no more. One day, Sheridan came home from his adventures in a thoughtful mood, laid out digital prints on the tired candlewick bedspread, and pondered them with a happy smile. Time to get the hell out of here, he said. I'm done. The hell is right, said Camilla, glancing and averting her eyes. Why so squeamish? I have to live, don't I? I can see why you want to leave. He put on his sunglasses and grinned at her. No one ever knows. I'm careful. Good, because I'm not done. I haven't finished. Not yet. The dark lenses give back a double image of her face, so richly shadowed. It's a shame she needs another partner, but 2 predators can't feed on each other. This is their eroticism, these tastes and smells, this contact at a remove, and it still thrills her. Sheridan always comes first, true, but Camilla likes it that way. Go, sister, says Sheridan, the big teenager. You look like you need a fix. That was a good little thing. Oh my God. 2 predators can't feed on each other. This is their eroticism. Okay, that was a nice little paragraph. Sorry. The car had been repaired. It arrived back at the B&B that evening. They announced their departure the next morning and settled the bill. Noreen was very sorry to see them go, but she made no fond farewells in front of Camilla's ersatz husband. I'm sure that was probably German. Camilla conveyed by a sad glance or two that the sudden decision was not her own, and that she wished they could say goodbye more warmly. She got up about an hour after midnight, Sheridan peacefully unconscious. The sheets, although freshly changed, still had that bad laundry smell. How does she do it, wondered Camilla, wrapping herself in an elegant blue and white kimono. Poor Noreen is a genius of poor housekeeping, of meager proportions. She went into the ensuite and checked her face. Good God, even the electricity in the mean fluorescent tube seems to come straight from the North Pole. Tiny crow's feet around her eyes, lines between her brows. Is that a broken vein? Can't be. Never mind. Soon this washed-out hag will disappear. The mirrors of civilization will restore Camilla's beauty, infused with fresh magic. For a last thrill, she walked the immeasurably ugly, pine-varnished passageways of the big lumpen house, possessing it like a ghost. American couples snore peacefully behind their brass number plates, dreaming of Blarney Castle and the Rock of Cashel. Noreen shares a room and a bed with Jonas, with baby Roisin in her cot. The baby, for a wonder, is not grizzling, but the house is unquiet. Camilla followed a trail of sound, buzzes and clicks, and muted thunderclaps. Silently, she opened a door and saw the BMX boy there in the shadows with his back to her, lost in contemplation of the graphics on his TV screen. His little hands were moving incessantly, clickety, clackety, clickety. Camilla knew the names of all the children. This one was Declan, the 10-year-old, fortunately immune to the virus that's going around. Sorry, I saw the word Declan and I got shot back to the Raven Boys. I'm a fangirl, whatever. He's actually a little young for that virus. The bud not quite bursting, the sap not yet on the rise, but he'd be immune anyway. There are rules. She slipped into the room and stood behind him, wondering about passions that she did not share. She was standing so close, it was amazing that the child didn't turn around. Over his shoulder, she could see her own face reflected on the screen, clearly visible within the racetrack image. Declan turned and saw nothing. An adult woman, a mother, a featureless conduit. Without changing expression, he turned back and resumed his game. Shuddering with horror, Camilla retreated, and that's Noreen's diet. That's all the feeding her poor starved soul ever gets. She went down to the TV lounge, feeling morally justified. I'm not a bad person, not entirely greedy. I give as well as take. A quarter of an hour and Noreen appeared, red-faced with sleep, her crop head tousled, bundled up in a dreadful dressing gown. I thought I heard. "Oh, Camilla, what is it?" Camilla was weeping, stifling her sobs with fists clenched against her teeth. She was beside herself. It was some time before she could be persuaded to talk. In choked half-sentences covering her face, she told the story. Her suspicions, her certainty, the terrible burden. "I can't prove it," she explained, "but I know, more surely every time it happens, he steals something from them. How can I say it? They surrender to him." "Jesus, God, you're saying he interferes with them?" "No," wailed Camilla. That's nothing. I'm saying he takes the life out of them. But, Camilla, nobody's died. No, he doesn't kill them. He's too clever for that. They die later, of something else, an accident, the flu. I've kept track. I know what happens, but he never gets the blame. What's worse is when they live, but it would be better if they didn't, because they're like him. I've known that happen, too. The harshly furnished room listened in shock. The big TV screen gazed somberly. Camilla showed Noreen the photographs. The young housewife trembled. She babbled of the police. Camilla said, "Then he'd kill me. Oh, God, I don't want to die." "I had to tell you," she wept. "I just had to tell. Oh, Noreen, the things I know." And then the broken whispers, the breath coming fast, the last protests, the surrender. Noreen agrees abjectly that she will not raise the alarm. Shivering, sickened, she is deflowered, degraded, made complicit in something monstrous. And she loves it. For Camilla, too, the experience was deeply satisfying. She left the room and crept back to number 4. A flash caught her as she opened the door, her lips still wet, features softened, and eyes blind with afterglow. "Gotcha!" cried Sheridan, brandishing the camera, grinning, and she laughed. It was almost as if he had kissed her. He turned away and checked the preview screen. He sounded disappointed, or maybe puzzled. "What is it?" "Oh, nothing." They left the big, stark yellow house early in the morning. Camilla found the moment of departure oddly disappointing. She would have liked to see Noreen again. She would have liked to see some consciousness, a touch of pallor, some shamed disquiet in the young housewife's eyes. But it's time to make a clean getaway. Noreen will wake up unsure that anything really happened in the night. She'll probably never miss what Camilla took from her. And that's the way it's supposed to be. In and out without a trace. Love them and leave them. She went into the kitchen for a moment and stood looking around. The smells of kippers, blood pudding, and laundry that's been dried indoors mingled sickeningly. Camilla felt suddenly deeply disoriented. The taste of Noreen's life was in her throat. She had a horrible, momentary vision of somehow staying here, being trapped here, with the slab of a husband, the indifferent children, the sonorous Americans chewing over cooked bacon in that drear, meager dining room. She felt she had become transparent, suffocated. Sheridan tooted on the Bentley's horn. "Shh!" muttered Camilla and hurried out to join him. The big car drove away. Noreen was up in time to hear them go. She'd had a sleepless night, but no staying in bed for Noreen. No one to bring her a tray. She had the breakfast for the guests to cook. Jonas in a poor temper, the children giving her hell and the baby fretful. But she was smiling. She stood in the porch and listened to the deep purr of the big car's engine. There they go, the beautiful people. She was fingering a rectangle of chased cream pasteboard, simply inscribed Camilla Shibu. Sibu? Siibu. Nothing else. No address. No phone number. That's arrogance, isn't it? But it doesn't matter. You never do see them again, the passing trade. She tucked the card into the drawer where she kept a select collection of such trophies. "I have lovely guests sometimes," she murmured. "It's lovely to have them." And she returned to her domestic servitude with a gleam of secret triumph in that beaming, rapacious smile. Her naive hazel eyes no longer hungry, but replete. They called ahead and booked a room in a place as far removed from that primitive B&B as money could buy. The country house hotel set in its own lush grounds. Now this is more like it. Sheridan handed over the keys to the Bentley. Camilla flashed an automatically dazzling smile at the boy who took their luggage and was faintly surprised to receive no eye kick of appreciation in return. They walked into the hotel and how wide the lobby seemed. It was not crowded but full of people. No one glanced her way. Or if they did, by chance, happen to look in Camilla's direction, they appeared to see nothing. By the time they reached the desk, she was feeling disquieted and strangely wary, as if that short walk had been a long trek across empty tundra. Camilla's progress through the human world has been, for so long, a continuous sip at the nectar of attention. Full-blown seduction is an occasional indulgence. She's not an addict like Sheridan. Her eternal beauty, everlasting youth, is nourished by subtler means. She doesn't even have to think about it. She is so used to eliciting the response. The admiration that comes back to her from almost any human being, male or female, young or old, is her daily bread, the air she breathes. Beautiful people feed like this. The rest are there to be fed upon. That's the law of nature. All the way up to their room, Sheridan placidly silent and indifferent beside her, she could not stop herself from peering at the glass walls of the lift, at a passing chambermaid, at the bellboy waiting for his tip. Nothing. She might as well be invisible. What's happened to me? What's wrong with you, Cam? What's wrong with you, Cam? Nothing, she says, sitting in the middle of the vast acreage of their room, on the king-sized bed, sumptuous with pillows, the white sheets crisp and fragrant. But where's Noreen, with her humble, hungry eyes? I think I'll have a shower. She went into the bathroom. As long as you can look at yourself in the mirror, you're not too far gone. That's what Sheridan says. One day all the mirrors will be empty, and sometimes, tired of the endless, repetitive toil of her delicate feeding, she has looked forward to the day when there will be no more subtlety, when they will have no choice but to be monsters. Really, neither of them wants to cross that borderline. It will be a kind of death. It's a fate they prefer to put off as long as possible, but this is something else. A fair-haired woman's face looks back at her, naked and wary, a little pale, a few fine lines, a few faint broken veins in the cheeks. There's nothing unusual about this reflection. It's neither old nor very young, neither beautiful nor ugly. There's certainly no mark of immortal evil. Oh God, she whispers. The redeemed, the newly mortal. What's happened to me? She turns her face. It's no use. Wherever she looks, every light is coming, pure and clear, straight from the north. Interesting. Okay, that was, let me say it again, A North Light by Gweneth Jones. And that was an interesting take on a vampire story. I'll be fair. I mean, you never know where these are going to go because everybody is a little bit different. But it would have been very easy for her to just be revealed that, like, you know, at the end of the story, Noreen's, like, covering up, like, a wound on her neck or something, you know? Like, they could have gone the very obvious, like, she's feeding from her. Her name is Camilla. Of course she is thing. I really like the, like, well, I can't think of the word, but subtlety, I guess. You don't really know what they're doing, but they very clearly know that they are predators and they are preying on these people, and you're not really sure what they're preying upon. I just really like that. It was ambiguity can be a lot of fun, especially when you know how to play with it, and I think that this author in this story knew how to play with that, and I enjoyed the story, and I don't have to keep talking about it, I guess. No, yeah, I really enjoy stories that were like, yes, this person proclaims to be a predator, but by the end of the story, you're not really sure who the real predator is. It can be really fun, especially if, like, maybe the author themselves don't have a clear idea what two predators accidentally, like, or intentionally preying on each other actually looks like. Like our ideas of what, like, bad people who harm others actually is and actually looks like. It can be very different depending on, like, you know, like, people's ages and maturity and things. So it's really interesting to, like, look at a story and, like, pick that apart. I didn't, like, script that. I don't know if I just talked in a circle or not. Thank you for continuing with me despite me rambling. Okay. This next one, Jack by Connie Willis, is, again, longer than the typical story I read on here. It's about 51 pages. So, buckle in. I'm gonna have to take a lot of sips so that my voice stays. I don't usually lose my voice, but I also don't usually talk for 2 hours straight, you know? Okay, the quote. About the following novella, she reveals, I became fascinated by the Blitz the first time I went to St. Paul's in London. It seemed impossible to me that the cathedral hadn't burned down that night in December. It still seems impossible, and I began doing research for the story that eventually became Firewatch, 1982. In the course of my reading, I kept seeing references to body sniffers, people who worked on the rescue squads who had an unusual knack for finding bodies. On a rational level, I knew that this was probably because they had exceptional hearing. Everybody was practically deaf from the continuous din, or were good guessers, or else were exceptionally lucky. It did occur to me, though, that there might be another more sinister reason. Saying that, I really am, like, when I was reading this earlier, I was, like, immediately, like, intrigued by this concept. Body sniffers. Like, it hadn't occurred to me that, like, yeah, people were being bombed, and, like, there would be people looking for the people who were harmed, and they had a name and stuff. It's, like, a thing that, like, yeah, that makes sense. Of course they would have that, but you never really think about it until somebody points it out, and you're like, oh, wait, huh. People did that, didn't they? Interesting. And then to add in the whole, like, vampire thing is just, like, really intriguing immediately for me. Okay. Going to start it now. Yes, that is a salsa jar full of tea. The night Jack joined our post, V was late. So was the Luftwaffe. The sirens still hadn't gone by 8 o'clock. Perhaps our Violet's tired of the rath and begun on the aircraft spotters, Morris said. And they're so taken by her charms they've forgotten to wind the sirens. You'd best watch out then, Swales said, taking off his tin warden's hat. He'd just come back from patrol. We made room for him at the linoleum-covered table, moving our teacups and the litter of gas masks and pocket torches. Twickenham shuffled his paper into one pile next to his typewriter and went on typing. Swales sat down and poured himself a cup of tea. She'll set her cap for the ARP next, he said, reaching for the milk. Morris pushed it towards him, and none of us will be safe. He grinned at me, especially the young ones, Jack. I'm safe, I said. I'm being called upon soon. Twickenham's the one who should be worrying. Twickenham looked up from his typing at the sound of his name. Worrying about what? He asked, his hands poised over the keyboard. Our Violet setting her cap for you, Swales said. Girls always go for poets. I'm a journalist, not a poet. What about Renfrew? He nodded his head toward the cots in the other room. Renfrew, Swales boomed, pushing his chair back and starting into the room. Shh, I said, don't wake him. He hasn't slept all week. You're right. It wouldn't be fair in his weakened condition. He sat back down. And Morris is married. What about your son, Morris? He's a pilot, isn't he? Stationed in London? Morris shook his head. Quincy's up at North Weald. Lucky that, Swales said. Looks as if that leaves you, Twickenham. Sorry, Twickenham said, typing. She's not my type. She's not anyone's type, is she? Wales said. The Raths, Morris said, and we all fell silent, thinking of Vi and her bewildering popularity with the RAF pilots in and around London. To be clear, for anybody who doesn't know this subject really well, when I say RAF, I mean it's capitalized RAF. Don't ask me what it means. I don't know. She had pale eyelashes and colorless brown hair she put up in flat little pin curls while she was on duty, which was against regulations, though Mrs. Lucy didn't say anything to her about them. V was dumpy and rather stupid. I have to decide, is she Vi for Violet or V for Violet? I'm going to try for Violet, so Vi. Vi was dumpy and rather stupid, and yet she was out constantly with one pilot after another, going to dances and parties. I still say she makes it all up, Swales said. She buys all those things she says they give her herself. All those oranges and chocolate. She buys them on the black market. On a full-time salary, I said. We only made £2 a week, and the things she brought home to the post, sweets and sherry and cigarettes, couldn't be bought on that. Vi shared them around freely, though liquor and cigarettes were against regulations as well. Mrs. Lucy didn't say anything about them either. She never reprimanded her wardens about anything, except being malicious about Vi, and we never gossiped in her presence. I wonder where she was. I hadn't seen her since I came in. Where's Mrs. Lucy? I asked. She's not late as well, is she? Morris nodded towards the pantry door. She's in her office. Olmwood's replacement is here. She's filling him in. Olmwood had been our best part-timer, a huge, out-of-work collier who could lift a house beam by himself, which is why Nelson, using his authority as district warden, had him transferred to his own post. I hope the new man's not any good, Swales said, or Nelson will steal him. I saw Olmwood yesterday, Morris said. He looked like Renfrew, only worse. He told me Nelson keeps them out the whole night patrolling and looking for incendiaries. There was no point in that. You couldn't see where the incendiaries were falling from the street, and if there was an incident, nobody was anywhere to be found. Mrs. Lucy had assigned patrols at the beginning of the Blitz, but within a week she'd stop them at midnight so we could get some sleep. Mrs. Lucy said she saw no point in our getting killed when everyone was already in bed anyway. Olmwood says Nelson makes them wear their gas masks. Olmwood says Nelson makes them wear their gas masks the entire time they're on duty and holds stirrup pump drills twice a shift, Morris said. Stirrup pump drills, Swales exploded. How difficult does he think it is to learn to use one? Nelson's not getting me on his post. I don't care if Churchill himself signs the transfer papers. The pantry door opened. Mrs. Lucy poked her head out. It's 8:30. The spotter'd better go upstairs, even if the sirens haven't gone, she said. Who's on duty tonight? Vi, I said, but she hasn't come in yet. Oh dear, she said. Perhaps someone had better go look for her. I'll go, I said, and started pulling on my boots. Thank you, Jack, she said. She shut the door. I stood up and tucked my pocket torch into my belt. I picked up my gas mask and slung it over my arm in case I ran into Nelson. The deregulations said they were to be worn while patrolling, but Mrs. Lucy had realized early on that you couldn't see anything with them on, which was why I thought she was the best post in the district, including Admiral Nelson's. Mrs. Lucy opened the door again and leaned out for a moment. She usually comes by underground. Sloane Square, she said. Take care. Right, Swales said. Vi might be lurking outside in the dark, waiting to pounce. He grabbed Twickenham round the neck and hugged him to his chest. I'll be careful, I said, and went up the basement stairs and out onto the street. I went the way Vi usually came from Sloane Square Station, but there was no one in the blackened... Ow, my foot. I always say weird and then my foot hurts. I went the way Vi usually came from Sloane Square Station, but there was no one in the blacked-out streets except a girl hurrying to the underground station, carrying a blanket, a pillow, and a dress on a hanger. I walked the rest of the way to the tube station with her to make sure she found her way, though it wasn't that dark. The nearly full moon was up, and there was a fire still burning down by the docks from the raid of the night before. Thanks awfully, the girl said, switching the hanger to her other hand so she could shake hands with me. She was much nicer looking than Vi, with blonde, very curly hair. I work for this old stew pot at John Lewis's, and she won't let me leave even a minute before closing, will she, even if the sirens have gone. I waited outside the station for a few minutes, and then walked up to the Brompton Road, thinking Vi might have come in at South Kensington instead, but I didn't see her, and she still wasn't at the post when I got back. We have a new theory for why the sirens haven't gone, Swales said. We've decided our Vi's set her cap at the Luftwaffe, and they've surrendered. Where's Mrs. Lucy, I asked. Still in with the new man, Twickenham said. I better tell Mrs. Lucy I couldn't find her, I said, and started for the pantry. Halfway there, the door opened, and Mrs. Lucy and the new man came out. He was scarcely a replacement for the burly Almwood. He was not much older than I was, slightly built, hardly the sort to lift house beams. His face was thin and rather pale, and I wondered if he was a student. This is our new part-timer, Mr. Settle, Mrs. Lucy said. She pointed to each of us in turn. Mr. Morris, Mr. Twickenham, Mr. Swales, Mr. Harker. She smiled at the part-timer and then at me. Mr. Harker's name is Jack, too, she said. I shall have to work at keeping you straight. A pair of Jacks, Swales said. Not a bad hand. The part-timer smiled. Cots are in there if you'd like to have a lie down, Mrs. Lucy said. And if the raids are close, the coal cellar's reinforced. I'm afraid the rest of the basement isn't, but I'm attempting to rectify that. She waved the papers in her hand. I've applied to the district warden for reinforcing beams. Gas masks are in there, she said, pointing at a wooden chest. Batteries for there, she said, pointing at a Batteries for the torches are in here, she pulled a drawer open, and the duty rosters posted on the wall. She pointed at the neat columns. Patrols here and watches here, and as you can see, Miss Western has the first watch for tonight. She's still not here, Twickenham said, not even pausing in his typing. I couldn't find her, I said. Oh dear, she said. I do hope she's all right. Mr. Twickenham, would you mind terribly taking Vi's watch? I'll take it, Jack said. Where do I go? I'll show him, I said, starting for the stairs. No, wait, Mrs. Lucy said. Mr. Settle, I'd hate to put you to work before you've even had a chance to become acquainted with everyone. There really isn't any need to go up till after the sirens have gone. Come and sit down, both of you. She took the flowered cozy off the teapot. Would you like a cup of tea, Mr. Settle? No, thank you, he said. She put the cozy back on and smiled at him. You're from Yorkshire, Mr. Settle, she said, as if we were all at a tea party. Whereabouts? Whitby, he said politely. What brings you to London? Morris said. The war, he said, still politely. Wanted to do your bit, eh? Yes. That's what my son Quincy said. Dad, he says, I want to do my bit for England. I'm going to be a pilot. Downed 21 planes he has, my Quincy, Morris told Jack, and been shot down twice himself. Oh, he's had some scrapes, I could tell you, but it's all top secret. Jack nodded. There were times I wondered whether Morris, like Violet with her rath pilots, had invented his son's exploits. Sometimes I even wondered if he had invented the son, though if that were the case, he might surely have made up a better name than Quincy. Dad, he says to me out of the blue, I've got to do my bit, and he shows me his enlistment papers. You could have knocked me over with a feather. Not that he's not patriotic, you understand, but he's had his little difficulties at school, sowed his wild oats, so to speak, and here he was saying, Dad, I want to do my bit. The sirens went, taking up one after the other. Mrs. Lucy said, Ah, well, here they are now, as if the guest had finally arrived at her tea party, and Jack stood up. If you'll just show me where the spotter's post is, Mr. Harker, he said. Jack, I said, it's a name that should be easy for you to remember. I took him upstairs to what had been Mrs. Lucy's cook's garret bedroom. Unlike the street, a perfect place to watch for incendiaries. It was on the 4th floor, higher than most of the buildings on the street, so one could see anything that fell on the roofs around. One could see the Thames, too, between the chimney pots, and in the other direction, the searchlights in Hyde Park. Mrs. Lucy had set a wing-backed chair by the window, from which the glass had been removed, and the narrow landing at the head of the stairs had been reinforced with heavy oak beams that even Almwood couldn't have lifted. One ducks out here when the bombs get close, I said, shining the torch on the beams. It'll be a swish and then a sort of rising whine. I led him into the bedroom. If you see incendiaries, call out and try to mark exactly where they fall on the roofs. I showed him how to use the gun sight mounted on a wooden base that we used for a sextant, and handed him the binoculars. Anything else you need? I asked. No, he said soberly. Thank you. I left him and went back downstairs. They were still discussing Violet. I'm really becoming worried about her, Mrs. Lucy said. One of the ack guns started up, and there was the dull crump of bombs far away, and we all stopped to listen. Me 109s, Morris said. They're coming in from the south again. I do hope she has the sense to get to a shelter, Mrs. Lucy said, and Vi burst in the door. Sorry I'm late, she said, setting a box tied with string on the table next to Twickenham's typewriter. She was out of breath, and her face was suffused with blood. I know I'm supposed to be on watch, but Harry took me out to see his plane this afternoon, and I had a horrid time getting back. She heaved herself out of her coat and hung it over the back of Jack's chair. You'll never believe what he named it. The Sweet Violet. She untied the string on the box. We were so late we hadn't time for tea, and he said, You take this to your post and have a good tea, and I'll keep the Jerrys busy until you're finished. She reached in the box and lifted out a torte with sugar icing. He's painted the name on the nose and put little violets in purple all around it, she said, setting it on the table. One for every Jerry he shot down. We stared at the cake. Eggs and sugar had been rationed since the beginning of the year, and they'd been in short supply even before that. I hadn't seen a fancy torte like this in over a year. It's raspberry filling, she said, slicing through the cake with a knife. They hadn't had any chocolate. She held the knife up, dripping jam. Now, who wants some, then? Not to stop this story in its tracks, but, Bestie, where are the vampires? Sorry if it's annoying for people who come to watch me and have me just constantly ask when there's a longer story where the vampires are, but I try to be honest with my thoughts here, to a degree. I have to hold in the autism need to rant about certain things, but maybe it's Violet. Maybe it's Violet and her cake. It's raspberry. I don't remember if I said this, so. It's raspberry filling, she said, slicing through the cake with a knife. They hadn't any chocolate. She held the knife up, dripping jam. Now, who wants some then? I do. I had been hungry since the beginning of the war and ravenous since I'd joined the ARP, especially for sweets. And I had my piece eaten before she'd finished setting slices on Mrs. Lucy's Wedgwood plates and passing them around. There was still a quarter left. Who's upstairs taking my watch, she said, sucking a bit of raspberry jam off her finger. The new part-timer, I said. I'll take it up to him. She cut a slice and eased it off the knife and onto the plate. What's he like? She asked. He's from Yorkshire, Twickenham said, looking at Mrs. Lucy. What did he do up there before the war? Mrs. Lucy looked at her cake as if surprised that it was nearly eaten. He didn't say, she said. I meant, is he handsome? Vi said, putting a fork on the plate with a slice of cake. Perhaps I should take it up to him myself. He's puny, pale, Swales said, his mouth full of cake. Looks as if he's got consumption. Nelson won't steal him anytime soon, that's certain, Morris said. Oh, well, then, Vi said and handed the plate to me. I took it and went upstairs, stopping on the second floor, landing to shift it in my left hand and switch. Wow, why did I read it like that? I took it and went upstairs, stopping on the second floor landing to shift it to my left hand and switch on my pocket torch. Jack was standing by the window, the binoculars dangling from his neck, looking out past the rooftops toward the river. The moon was up, reflecting the whitely off the water like one of the German flares lighting the bomber's way. Anything in our sector yet? No, he said without turning around. They're still to the east. I've brought you some raspberry cake, I said. He turned and looked at me. I held the cake out. Violet's young man in the rath sent it. No, thank you, he said. I'm not fond of cake. I looked at him with the same disbelief I had felt for Violet's name emblazoned on a spitfire. There's plenty, I said. She brought a whole tort. I'm not hungry, thanks. You eat it. Are you sure? One can't get this sort of thing these days. I'm certain, he said, and turned back to the window. I looked hesitantly at the slice of cake, guilty about my greed, but hating to see it go to waste and still hungry. At the least I should stay up and keep him company. Violet's the warden whose watch you took. The one who was late, I said. I sat down on the floor, my back to the painted baseboard, and started to eat. She's full-time. We've got 5 full-timers. Violet and me and Renfrew. You haven't met him yet. He's asleep. He'd had rather a bad time. Can't sleep in the day, and Morris and Twickenham. And then there's Petersby. He's part-time like you. He didn't turn round while I was talking or say anything, only continued looking out the window. A scattering of flares drifted down, lighting the room. They're a nice lot, I said, cutting a bit of cake with my fork. In the odd light from the flares, the jam filling looked black. Swales could be rather a nuisance with his teasing sometimes, and Twickenham will ask you all sorts of questions, but they're good men on an incident. He turned around. Questions? For the Post newspaper. Notice sheet, really, information on new sorts of bombs, ARP regulations, that sort of thing. All Twickenham's supposed to do is type it and send it round to the other posts, but I think he's always fancied himself an author, and now he's got his chance. He's named the notice sheet Twickenham's Twitterings, and he adds all sorts of things, drawings, news, gossip, interviews. Honestly, that's adorable. I would also take advantage of that if I could. And yes, it did occur to me. Twitterings. While I had been talking, the drone of engines overhead had been growing steadily louder. It passed. There was a sighing whoosh and then a whistle that turned into a whine. Stairs, I said, dropping my plate. I grabbed his arm and yanked him into the shelter of the landing. We crouched against the blast, my hands over my head, but nothing happened. The whine became a scream and then sounded suddenly further off. I peeked around the reinforcing beam at the open window. Light flashed, and then the crump came, at least 3 sectors away. Louise, I said, going over to the window to see if I could tell exactly where it went. High explosive bomb. Jack focused the binoculars where I was pointing. I went out to the landing, cupped my hands, and shouted down the stairs, H.E., Louise. The planes were still too close to bother sitting down again. Twickenham's done interviews with all the wardens, I said, leaning against the wall. He'll want to know what you did before the war, why you became a warden, that sort of thing. He wrote up a piece on Vi last week. Jack had lowered the binoculars and was watching where I had pointed. The fires didn't start right away with a high explosive bomb. It took a bit for the ruptured gas mains and scattered coal fires to catch. What was she before the war, he asked. Vi? A stenographer, I said, and something of a wallflower, I should think. The war's been rather a blessing for our Vi. A blessing, Jack said, looking out at the high explosive in Lee's. From where I was sitting, I couldn't see his face except in silhouette, and I couldn't tell whether he disapproved of the word or was merely bemused by it. I didn't mean a blessing exactly. One can scarcely call something as dreadful as this a blessing, but the war's given Vi a chance she wouldn't have had otherwise. Morris says without it she'd have died an old maid, and now she's got all sorts of beaux. A flare drifted down, white and then red. Morris says the war is the best thing that ever happened to her. Morris, he said, as if he didn't know which one that was. Sandy hair, toothbrush mustache, I said. His son's a pilot. Doing his bit, he said, and I could see his face clearly in the reddish light, but I still couldn't read his expression. A stick of incendiaries came down over the river, glittering like sparklers, and fires sprang up everywhere. The next night, there was a bad incident off Old Church Street. 2 HEs. Should I just say he's? He's feels wrong. Mrs. Lucy sent Jack and me over to see if we could help. It was completely overcast, which was supposed to stop the Luftwaffe, but obviously hadn't, and very dark. By the time we reached King's Road, I had completely lost my bearings. I knew the incident had to be close, though, because I could smell it. It wasn't truly a smell. It was a painful sharpness in the nose from the plaster dust and smoke and whatever explosive the Germans put in their bombs. It always made V sneeze. Sorry. I tried to make out landmarks, but all I could see was the slightly dark outline of a hill on my left. I thought blankly, we must be lost. There aren't any hills in Chelsea, and then realized it must be the incident. The first thing we do is find the incident officer, I told Jack. I looked around for the officer's blue light, but I couldn't see it. It must be behind the hill. I scrabbled up it with Jack behind me, trying not to slip on the uncertain slope. The light was on the far side of another, lower hill, a ghostly bluish blur off to the left. It's over there, I said. We must report in. Nelson's likely to be the incident officer, and he's a stickler for procedure. I started down, skidding on the broken bricks and plaster. Be careful, I called to Jack. There are all sorts of jagged pieces of wood and glass. Jack, he said. I turned around. He had stopped halfway down the hill and was looking up as if he had heard something. I glanced up, afraid the bombers were coming back, but couldn't hear anything over the anti-aircraft guns. Jack stood motionless, his head down now, looking at the rubble. What is it? I asked. He didn't answer. He snatched his torch out of his pocket and swung it wildly round. You can't do that, I shouted. There's a blackout on. He snapped it off. Go and find something to dig with, he said, and dropped to his knees. There's someone alive down here. Under here, but whatever. He wrenched the banister free and began stabbing into the rubble with its broken ends. I looked stupidly at him. How do you know? He jabbed viciously at the mess. Get a pickaxe. This stuff's hard as a rock. He looked up at me impatiently. Hurry! The incident officer was someone I didn't know. I was glad. Nelson would have refused to give me a pickaxe without the necessary authorization, and lectured me instead on departmentalization of duties. This officer, who was younger than me, and broken out in spots under his powdering of brick dust, didn't have a pickaxe, but he gave me 2 shovels without any argument. The dust and smoke were clearing a bit by the time I started back across the mounds, and a shower of flares drifted down over by the river, lighting everything in a fuzzy, overbright light, like headlights in a fog. I could see Jack on his hands and knees halfway down the mound, stabbing with the banister. He looked like he was murdering someone with a knife, plunging it in again and again. Another shower of flares came down, much closer. I ducked and hurried across to Jack, offering him one of the shovels. That's no good, he said, waving it away. What's wrong? Can't you hear the voice anymore? He went on jabbing in the banister. What? He said, and looked in the flares, dazzling lightly, like he had no idea what I was talking about. The voice you heard, I said. Has it stopped calling? It's the stuff, he said. There's no way to get a shovel into it. Did you bring any baskets? I hadn't, but further down the mound I had seen a large tin saucepan. I fetched it for him and began digging. He was right, of course. I got one good shovelful and then struck an end of a floor joust and bent the blade of the shovel. I tried to get it under the joist, so I could pry it upward, but it was wedged under a large section of beam further on. I gave it up, broke off another of the banisters, and got down beside Jack. The beam was not the only thing holding the joist down. The rubble looked loose, bricks and chunks of plaster and pieces of wood, but it was as solid as cement. Swales, who showed up out of nowhere when we were 3 feet down, said, "It's the clay. All London's built on it, hard as statues." He had brought 2 buckets with him, and the news that Nelson had shown up and had had a fight with the spotty officer over whose incident it was. It's my incident, Nelson says, and gets out the map to show him how this side of King's Road is in his district. Sorry, there's weird paragraphing happening. I'm not sure. Oh, okay. One guy is quoting the other. So I got a little lost in the sauce there, and I was like, wait, who's speaking? What? Is this a typo? It's my incident, Nelson says, and gets out the map to show him how this side of King's Road is on his district. Swales said gleefully, and the incident officer says, "Your incident? Who wants the bloody thing, I say," he says. Even with Swales helping, the going is so slow, whoever was under there would probably have suffocated or bled to death before we could get to them. Jack didn't stop at all, even when the bombs were directly overhead. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, though none of us heard anything in those brief intervals of silence, and Jack seemed scarcely to listen. The banister he was using broke off in the iron-hard clay, and he took mine and kept digging. A broken clock came up, and an egg cup. Morris arrived. He had been evacuating people from 2 streets over where a bomb had buried itself in the middle of the street without exploding. Swales told him the story of Nelson and the spotty young officer, and then went off to see what he could find out about the inhabitants of the house. Clearly, I need a little break to process what I'm reading. Boy, I said it was like 30 pages, right? Are we at least halfway? 50, so we're 10, 11 pages in. We're almost halfway. Jack came up out of the hole. "I need braces," he said. "The sides are collapsing." I found some unbroken bed slats at the base of the mound. One of the slats was too long for the shaft. Jack sawed it halfway through and then broke it off. Swales came back. "Nobody in the house," he shouted down the hole. "The Colonel and Mrs. Godalming went to Surrey this morning." The all clear sounded, drowning out his words. Jack said from the hole, and I turned around to see if the rescue squad had brought it down with him. "Jack," he said again, more urgently. I leaned over the tunnel. "What time is it?" he said. "About 5, I said. "The all clear just went." "Is it getting light?" "Not yet," I said. "Have you found anything?" "Yes," he said. "Give us a hand." I eased myself into the hole. I could understand his question. It was pitch dark down here. I switched my torch on. It lit up our faces from beneath like specters. "In there," he said, and reached for a banister, just like the one he'd been digging with. "Is he under a stairway?" I said, and the banister clutched at his hand. It only took a minute or 2 to get him out. Jake pulled on the arm I had mistaken for a banister, and I scrabbled through the last few inches of plaster and clay to the little cave he was in, formed by an icebox and a door leading against each other. "Colonel Godalming?" I said, reaching for him. He shook off my hand. "Where the freaking hell have you people been?" he said. "Taking a tea break?" He was in full evening dress, and his big mustache was covered with plaster dust. "What sort of country is this? Leave a man to dig himself out," he shouted, brandishing a serving spoon full of plaster in Jack's face. "I could have dug all the way to China in the time it took you blighters to get me out." Hands came down into the hole and hoisted him up. "Blasted incompetence," he yelled. We pushed on the seat of his elegant trousers. "Slackers, the lot of you. Couldn't find the nose in front of your own face." Colonel Godalming had in fact left for Surrey the day before, but had decided to come back for his hunting rifle in case of invasion. "Can't rely on the blasted civil defense to stop the Jerrys," he had said as I led him down to the ambulance. It was starting to get light. The incident was smaller than I'd thought, not much more than 2 blocks square. What I had taken for a mound to the south was actually a squat office block, and beyond it the row of houses hadn't even had their windows blown out. The ambulance had pulled up as near as possible to the mound. I helped him over to it. "What's your name?" he said, ignoring the doors I'd opened. "I intend to report you to your superiors," and the other one practically pulled my arm out of its socket. "Where he's got to." "He had to go to his day job," I said. As soon as we had Godalming out, Jack had switched on his pocket torch again to glance at his watch and said, "I've got to leave." God, it's such an awkward name to say. Let me spell it. Godalming. Godalming probably is more sense than Godalming. I told him I'd check him out with the incident officer and started to help Godalming down the mound. Now I was sorry I hadn't gone with him. "Day job," Godalming snorted. "Gone off to take a nap is more like it. Lazy slacker. Nearly breaks my arm and then goes off and leaves me to die. I'll have his job." Without him, we'd never even have found you, I said angrily. He's the one who heard your cries for help. Cries for help, the colonel said, going red in the face. Cries for help? Why would I cry out to a lot of darned slackers? The ambulance driver got out of the car and came round to see what the delay was. Accused me of crying out like a darned coward, he blustered to her. I didn't make a sound. Knew it wouldn't do any good. Knew if I didn't dig myself out, I'd be there till kingdom come. Nearly had myself out, too, and then he comes along and accuses me of blubbering like a baby. It's monstrous, that's what it is. Monstrous. She took hold of his arm. What do you think you're doing, young woman? You should be at home instead of out running round in short skirts. It's indecent, that's what it is. She shoved him, still protesting, onto a bunk and covered him up with a blanket. I slammed the doors to, watched her off, and then made a circuit of the incident, looking for Swales and Morris. The rising sun appeared between two bands of cloud, reddening the mounds and glinting off a broken mirror. I couldn't find either of them, so I reported in to Nelson, who was talking angrily on a field telephone and who nodded and waved me off when I tried to tell him about Jack, and then went back to the post. Swales was already regaling Morris and Vi, who were eating breakfast, with an imitation of Colonel Godalming. Mrs. Lucy was still filling out papers, apparently the same form as when we'd left. Huge mustaches, Swales was saying, his hand 2 feet apart to illustrate their size, like walruses, and tailless, if you please. Oi, say, this is disgraceful, he sputtered, his right hand squinted shut with an imaginary monocle. What's the empire coming to when a man can't even be rescued? He dropped into his natural voice. I thought he was going to have our 2 Jacks court-martialed on the spot. He peered round me. We're settled. He had to go to his day job, I said. Just as well, he said, screwing the monocle back on. The colonel looked like he was coming back with the Royal Lancers. He raised his arm, gripping an imaginary sword. Charge! Vi tittered. Mrs. Lucy looked up and said, Violet, make Jack some toast. Sit down, Jack. He looked done in. I took my helmet off and started to set it on the table. It was caked with plaster dust, so thick it was impossible to see the red W through it. I hung it on my chair and sat down. Morris shoved a plate of kippers at me. You never know what they're going to do when you get them out, he said. Some of them fall all over you, sobbing, and some act like they're doing you a favor. I had one old woman acted all offended, claimed I made an improper advance when I was working her leg free. Renfrew came in from the other room, wrapped in a blanket. He looked as bad as I thought I must, his face slack and gray with fatigue. Where was the incident? He asked anxiously. Just off Old Church Street in Nelson's sector, I added to try to reassure him. Oh, I messed that up because I was zoning out and thinking about, what's that one movie of the journalist guy who finds a guy in a mine? It's like something Aces or something. It doesn't matter. It just hopped into my brain because I was thinking about all the ways people who get rescued act. But the plot of the story was the guy. It doesn't matter. I'm being stupid. Sorry. I have ADD brain. Oh, it's gonna bother me. What is it called, though? It's got that hot old guy in it. Renfrew came in from another room, wrapped in a blanket. He looked as bad as I thought I must, his face slack and gray with fatigue. Where was the incident? He asked anxiously. Just off Old Church Street in Nelson's sector, I added to reassure him. But he said nervously, they're coming closer every night. Have you noticed? Isn't it like Ace in the Hole? I swear to God, it's like Ace in the Hole. I don't know why I'm looking. I turned my Wi-Fi keyboard off. It doesn't matter. You know why I'm zoning out? Because we're halfway through the story and I just want a vampire. So far we have a guy who uncannily found a living man who wasn't screaming, apparently. That's fine. I want blood and guts. I want blood, guts, and fear. I'm gonna look up Ace in the Hole. Why does it matter? You know why it matters? Because the one guy was hot. The one guy was hot, and that's all I care about. Does he get stuck in there with him? Kirk Douglas. What is the plot of that movie? No. It doesn't matter. The me alone. I have ADD brain. Like, it wouldn't be such a big deal if there isn't any vampires, if this was an interesting story, but it's just a bunch of people talking. Something's missing here. Like a spookiness or like a point to these characters existing within a story. Does that even make sense? I don't know. Okay. I don't know how much of this to reread. Because I know I reread it at least twice. You get to listen to these sentences again. Congratulations. Renfrew came in from the other room, wrapped in a blanket. He looked as bad as I thought I must, his face slack and gray with fatigue. Where was the incident, he asked anxiously. Just off Old Church Street, in Nelson's sector, I added to reassure him. But he said nervously, they're coming closer every night. Have you noticed that? No, they aren't, Vi said. We haven't had anything in our sector all week. Renfrew ignored her. First, Gloucester Road. And then Ixworth Place, and now Old Church Street. It's as if they're circling, searching for something. London, Mrs. Lucy said briskly, and if we don't enforce the blackout, they're likely to find it. She handed Morris a typed list. Reported infractions from last night. Go round and reprimand them. She put her hand on Renfrew's shoulder. Why don't you go have a nice lie down, Mr. Renfrew, while I cook your breakfast? I'm not hungry, he said, but he let her lead him, clutching his blanket, back to the cot. We watched Mrs. Lucy spread the blanket over him and then lean down and tuck it in around his shoulders. And then Swales said, you know who this Godalming fellow reminds me of? A lady we rescued over in Gower Street, he said, yawning. He hauled her out and asked her if her husband was in there with her. No, she says. The freaking cowards at the front. We all laughed. People like this colonel person don't deserve to be rescued, Vi said, spreading oleo on a slice of toast. You should have left him there a while and seen how he liked it. He was lucky they didn't leave him there altogether, Morris said. The register had him in Surrey with his wife. Lucky he had such a loud voice, Swales said. He twirled the end of an enormous mustache. Oi say, he boomed. Get me out of here immediately, you slackers. Immediately. But he said he didn't call out, I thought, and could hear Jack shouting over the din of the anti-aircraft guns, the drone of the planes. There's someone under there. Mrs. Lucy came back to the table. I've applied for reinforcements for the post, she said, standing her papers on end and tamping them with into an even stack. Someone from the town hall will be coming to inspect in the next few days. She picked up 2 bottles of ale and an ashtray and carried them over to the dustbin. Applied for reinforcements? Swales asked. Why? Okay, yeah, clearly I need a drink. Someone from the town hall will be coming to inspect in the next few days. She picked up 2 bottles of ale and an ashtray and carried them over to the dustbin. Applied for reinforcements, Swales asked. Why? Afraid Colonel Godalming will be back with the heavy artillery? There was a loud banging on the door. Oi, say, Swales said. Here he is now, and he's brought his hounds. Mrs. Lucy opened the door. Worse, Vi whispered, diving for the last bottle of ale. It's Nelson. She passed the bottle to me under the table, and I passed it to Renfield, who tucked it under his blanket. Mr. Nelson, Mrs. Lucy said, as if she were delighted to see him. Do come in. And how are things over your way? We took a beating last night, he said, glaring at us as though we were responsible. He had a complaint from the colonel, Swales whispered to me. You're done for, mate. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that, Mrs. Lucy said. Now, how may I help you? He pulled a folded paper from the pocket of his uniform and carefully opened it out. This was forwarded to me from the city engineer, he said. All requests for material improvements are to be sent to the district warden, not over his head to the town hall. Oh, I'm so glad, Mrs. Lucy said, leading him into the pantry. It is such a comfort to deal with someone who knows. Okay, I added the who knows. I added the who in the who knows. it doesn't have it. There's a typo, and I just like. It is such a comfort to deal with someone who knows rather than a faceless bureaucracy. If I had realized you were the proper person to appeal to, I should have contacted you immediately. She shut the door. Renfield took the ale bottle out from under his blanket and buried it in the dustbin. Violet began taking out her bobby pins. We'll never get our reinforcements now, Swales said, not with Adolf von Nelson in charge. Shh, Vi said, yanking at her snail-like curls. You don't want him to hear you. Olmwood told me he makes them keep working at an incident, even when the bombs are right overhead. Thinks all the posts should do it. Shush, Vi said. He's a bleeding Nazi, Swales said, but he lowered his voice. Got 2 of his wardens killed that way. You better not let him find out you and Jack are good at finding bodies, or you'll be out there dodging shrapnel, too. Good at finding bodies. I thought of Jack, standing motionless, looking at the rubble and saying, there's someone alive under here. Hurry. That's why Nelson steals from the other posts, Vi said, scooping her bobby pins off the table and into her haversack, because he does his own in. She pulled out a comb and began yanking it through her snarled curls. The pantry door opened and Nelson and Mrs. Lucy came out, Nelson still holding the unfolded paper. She was still wearing her tea party smile, but it was a bit thin. I'm sure you can see it's unrealistic to expect 9 people to huddle in a coal cellar for hours at a time, she said. There are people all over London huddling in coal cellars for hours at a time, as you put it, Nelson said coldly, who do not wish their civil defense funds spent on frivolities. I do not consider the safety of my wardens a frivolity, she said, though it is clear to me that you do, as witnessed by your very poor record. Nelson stared for a full minute as Mrs. Lucy, trying to think of a retort, and then turned on me. Your uniform is a disgrace, Warden, he said, and stomped out. Whatever it was Jack had used to find Colonel Godalming, it didn't work on incendiaries. He searched as haphazardly for them as the rest of us. Vi, who had been on spotter duty, shouting directions. No, further down Fulham Road, in the grocer's. She had apparently been daydreaming about her pilots instead of spotting. The incendiary was not in the grocer's, but in the butcher's 3 doors down. And by the time Jack and I got to it, the meat locker was on fire. It wasn't hard to put out. There were no furniture or curtains to catch, and the cold kept the wooden shelves from catching. But the butcher was extravagantly grateful. He insisted on wrapping up 5 pounds of lamb chops in white paper and thrusting them into Jack's arms. Did you really have to be at your day job so early, or were you only trying to escape the colonel? I asked Jack on the way back to the post. Was he that bad? He said, handing me the parcel of lamb chops. He nearly took my head off when I said you'd heard him shouting. Said he didn't call for help. Said he was digging himself out. The white butcher's paper was so bright the Luftwaffe would think it was a searchlight. I tucked the parcel inside my overalls so it wouldn't show. What sort of work is it, your day job? I asked. War work, he said. Did they transfer you? Is that why you came to London? No, he said. I wanted to come. We turned into Mrs. Lucy Street. Why did you join the ARP? I'm waiting to be called up, I said, so no one would hire me. And you wanted to do your bed? Yes, I said, wishing I could see his face. What about Mrs. Lucy? Why did she become a warden? Mrs. Lucy? I asked blankly. The question had never even occurred to me. She was the best warden in London. It was her natural calling, and I'd thought of her as always having been one. I've no idea, I said. It's her house. She's a widow. Perhaps the civil defense commandeered it, and she had to become one. It's the tallest in the street. I tried to remember what Twickenham had written about her in his interview. Before the war, she was something to do with a church. A church, he said, and I wished again I could see his face. I couldn't tell in the dark whether he spoke in contempt or longing. She was a deaconess or something, I said. What sort of war work is it? Munitions? No, he said, and walked on ahead. Mrs. Lucy met us at the door of the post. I gave her the package of lamb chops, and Jack went upstairs to replace Vi as spotter. Mrs. Lucy cooked the chops up immediately, running upstairs to the kitchen during a lull in the raids for salt and a jar of mint sauce, standing over the gas ring at the end of the table and turning them for what seemed an eternity. They smelled wonderful. Twickenham passed around newly run-off copies of
Twickenham's twitterings. Something for you to read while you wait for your dinner, he said proudly. The lead article was about the change in address of Sub-Post D, which had taken a partial hit that broke the water mains. Had Nelson refused them reinforcements too? Swales asked. Listen to this, Petersby said. He read aloud from the news sheet. The crime rate in London has risen 28% since the beginning of the blackout. And no wonder, Vi said, coming down from upstairs. You can't see your nose in front of your face at night, let alone someone lurking in an alley. I'm always afraid someone's going to jump out at me while I'm on patrol. All those houses standing empty and half of London sleeping in the shelters, Swale said. It's easy pickings. If I was a bad un, I'd come straight to London. It's disgusting, Morris said indignantly, the idea of someone taking advantage of there being a war like that to commit crimes. Oh, Mr. Morris, that reminds me. You're so... I was thinking, and this, every time I start thinking, I mess up a bunch of words apparently, but I was thinking like, yeah, people are probably going to commit crimes during a war because they're hungry and homeless, because there's bombs everywhere, and there's a lot of rationing. And they still have to, I don't know, somehow eat. Okay, Oh, Mr. Morris, that reminds me. Your son telephoned, Mrs. Lucy said, cutting into a chop to see if it was done. Blood welled up. He said he'd a surprise for you and you were to come out too. She switched the fork to her left hand and rummaged in her overall pocket till she found a slip of paper. North Weld on Monday, I think. His commanding officers made the necessary travel arrangements for you. I wrote it all down. She handed it to him and went back to turning the chops. A surprise, Morris said, sounding worried. He's not in trouble, is he? His commanding officer wants to see me? I don't know. He didn't say what it was about, only that he wanted you to come. Vi went over to Mrs. Lucy and peered into the skillet. I'm glad it was the butcher's and not the grocer's, she said. Rutabagas wouldn't have cooked up half so nice. Mrs. Lucy speared a chop, put it on a plate, and handed it to Vi. Take this up to Jack, she said. He doesn't want any, Vi said. She took the plate and sat down at the table. Did he say why he didn't? I asked. She looked curiously at me. I suppose he's not hungry, she said, or perhaps he doesn't like lamb chops. I do hope he's not in any trouble, Morris said, and it took me a minute to realize he was talking about his son. He's not a bad boy, but he does things without thinking. Youthful high spirits, that's all it is. He didn't eat the cake either, I said. Did he say why he didn't want the lamb chop? If Mr. Settle doesn't want it, then take it to Mr. Renfrew, Lucy said sharply. She snatched the plate away from Vi. And don't let him tell you he's not hungry. He must eat. He's getting very run down. Vi sighed and stood up. Mrs. Lucy handed her back the plate and she went into the other room. We all need to eat plenty of good food and get lots of sleep, Mrs. Lucy said reprovingly, to keep our strength up. I've written an article about it in the Twitterings, Twickenham said, beaming. It's known as walking death. It's brought about by lack of sleep and poor nutrition, with the anxiety of the raids. The Walking Dead exhibit slowed reaction time. Oh my god. The Walking Dead exhibit slowed reaction time and impaired judgment, which result in increased accidents on the job. Well, I won't have any Walking Dead among my wardens, Mrs. Lucy said, dishing up the rest of the chops. As soon as you've had these, I want you all to go to bed. Is the vampire Jack, the man who can find someone in a house and doesn't like pork chops? Is the problem, is the spooky part that he doesn't like pork chops? That he likes to leave during the sunrise? Well, I won't have any Walking Dead among my wardens, Mrs. Lucy said, dishing up the rest of the chops. As soon as you've had these, I want you all to go to bed. The chops tasted even better than they had smelled. I ate mine, reading Twickenham's article on the Walking Dead. It said that loss of appetite was a common reaction to the raids. It also said that lack of sleep could cause compulsive behavior and odd fixations. The Walking Dead may become convinced that they are being poisoned or that a friend or relative is a German agent. They may hallucinate, hearing voices, seeing visions, or believing fantastical things. He was in trouble at school before the war, but he's steadied down since he joined up, Morris said. I wonder what he's done. At 3 the next morning, a landmine exploded in almost the same spot off Old Church Street as the HEs. Nelson sent Almwood to ask for help, and Mrs. Lucy ordered Swales, Jack, and me to go with him. The mine didn't land more'n 2 houses away from the first crater, Almwood said, while we were getting on our gear. The Jerrys couldn't have come closer if they'd been aiming at it. I know what they're aiming at, Renfrew said from the doorway. He looked terrible, pale and drawn as a ghost. And I know why you've applied for reinforcements for the post. It's me, isn't it? They're after me. They're not after any of us, Mrs. Lucy said firmly. They're 2 miles up. They're not aiming for anything. Why would Hitler want to bomb you more than the rest of us, Swales said. I don't know. He sank down on one of the chairs and put his head in his hands. I don't know, but they're after me. I can feel it. Mrs. Lucy had sent Swales, Jack, and me to the incident because, quote, you've been there before, you'll know the terrain, unquote. But that was a fond hope. Since they explode above ground, landmines do considerably more damage than HEs. There was now a hill where the incident officer's tent had been, and 3 more beyond it, a mountain range in the middle of London. Swales started up the nearest peak to look for the incident officer's light. Jack, over here. Somebody called from the hill behind us, and both of us scrambled up a slope towards the voice. A group of 5 men were halfway up the hill looking down into a hole. Jack, the man yelled again. He was wearing a blue foreman's armband, and he was looking straight past us at someone toiling up the slope with what looked like a stirrup pump. I thought, surely they're not trying to fight a fire down that shaft, and then saw it wasn't a pump. It was, in fact, an automobile, Jack, and the man with the blue armband reached between us for it, lowered it down the hole, and scrambled in after it. The rest of the rescue squad stood looking down into the blackness as if they could actually see something. After a while, they began handing empty buckets down into the hole and pulling them out heaped full of broken bricks and pieces of splintered wood. None of them took any notice of us, even when Jack held out his hands to take one of the buckets. We're from Chelsea, I shouted to the foreman over the din of the planes and bombs. What can we do to help? They went on bucket brigading. A china teapot came up on the top of one load, covered with dust but not even chipped. I tried again. Who is it down there? 2 of them, the man nearest me said. He plucked the teapot off the heap and handed it to a man wearing a balaclava under his helmet. Man and a woman. We're from Chelsea, I shouted over a burst of anti-aircraft fire. What do you want us to do? He took the teapot away from the man with the balaclava and handed it to me. Take this down to the pavement with the other valuables. It took me a long while to get down the slope, holding the teapot in one hand and the lid on with the other and trying to keep my footing among the broken bricks, and even longer to find any pavement. The landmine had heaved most of it up and the street with it. I finally found it, a square of unbroken pavement in front of a blown-out bakery with the valuables neatly lined up against it, a radio, a boot, 2 serving spoons like the one Colonel Godalming had threatened me with, a lady's beaded evening bag. A rescue worker was standing guard next to them. Halt, he said, stepping in front of them as I came up, holding a pocket torch or a gun. No one's allowed inside the incident perimeter. ARP, I said hastily. Jack Harker, Chelsea. I held up the teapot. They sent me down here with this. It was a torch. He flicked it on and off, an eye blink. Sorry, he said. We've had a good deal of looting recently. He took the teapot and placed it at the end of the line next to the evening bag. Caught a man last week going through the pockets of the bodies laid out in the street waiting for the mortuary van. Terrible how some people will take advantage of something like this. I went back to where the rescue workers were digging. Jack was at the mouth of the shaft, hauling buckets up and handing them back. I got in line behind him. Have they found them yet? I asked him as soon as there was a lull in the bombing. Quiet! A voice shouted from the hole, and the man in the balaclava repeated, Quiet, everyone. We must have absolute quiet. Everyone stopped working and listened. Jack had handed me a bucket full of bricks, and the handle cut into my hands. For a second there was absolute silence, and then the drone of a plane and the distant swish and crump of an HE. Don't worry, the voice from the hole shouted. We're nearly there. The buckets began coming up out of the hole again. I hadn't heard anything, but apparently down in the shaft they had a voice, or the sound of tapping, and I felt relieved. Both that one of them at least was still alive, and that the diggers were on course. I'd been on an incident in October where we'd had to stop halfway down and sink a new shaft because the rubble kept distorting and displacing the sound. Even if the shaft was directly above the victim, it tended to go crooked in working past obstacles, and the only way to keep it straight was with frequent soundings. I thought of Jack digging for Colonel Godalming with the banister. He hadn't taken any soundings at all. He had seemed to know exactly where he was going. The men in the shaft called for the jack again, and Jack and I lowered it down to them. As the man below it reached up to take it, Jack stopped. He raised his head as if he was listening. What is it? I said. I couldn't hear anything but the ack-ack guns in Hyde Park. Did you hear someone calling? Where's the freaking Jack? The foreman shouted. It's too late, Jack said to me. They're dead. Come along, get it down here, the foreman shouted. We haven't got all day. He handed the jack down. Quiet, the foreman shouted. And above us, like a ghostly echo, we could hear the balaclava shout, Quiet, please, everyone. A church clock began to chime, and I could hear the balaclava say irritably, We must have absolute quiet. The clock chimed 4 and stopped, and there was a skittering sound of dirt falling on metal, then silence, and a faint sound. Quiet, the foreman called, and there was another silence, and the sound again, a whimper, or a moan. We hear you, he shouted. Don't be afraid. One of them's still alive, I said. Jack didn't say anything. We just heard them, I said angrily. Jack shook his head. We'll need lumber for bracing, the man in the balaclava said to Jack, and I expected him to tell him it was no use, but he went off immediately and came back dragging a white-painted bookcase. It still had 3 books in it. I helped Jack in the balaclava knock the shelves out of the case and then took the books down to the store of quote-unquote valuables. The guard was sitting on the pavement going through the beaded evening bag. Taking inventory, he said, scrambling up hastily. He jammed a lipstick and a handkerchief into the bag, so's to make certain nothing gets stolen. I brought you something to read, I said, and laid the books next to the teapot. Crime and Punishment. I toiled back up the hill and helped Jack lower the bookshelves down the shaft, and after a few minutes, buckets began coming up again. We reformed our scraggly bucket brigade, and the balaclava at the head of it, and me, and then Jack at its end. The all-clear went. As soon as it wound down, the foreman took another sounding. This time we didn't hear anything, and when the buckets started again, I handed them to Jack without looking at him. It began to get light in the east, a slow graying of the hills above us. 2 of them, several stories high, stood where the row of houses that had escaped the night before had been, and we were still in their shadow, though I could see the shaft now, with the end of one of the white bookshelves sticking up from it like a gravestone. The buckets began to come more slowly. Put out your cigarettes, the foreman called up, and we all stopped, trying to catch the smell of gas. If they were dead, as Jack had said, it was most likely gas leaking in from the broken mains that had killed them, and not internal injuries. The week before, we had brought up a boy and his dog, not a scratch on them. The dog had barked and whimpered almost up to when we found them, and the ambulance driver said she thought they'd only been dead a few minutes. I couldn't smell any gas, and after a minute, the foreman said excitedly, I see them. The balaclava leaned over the shaft, his hand on his knees. Are they alive? Yes, fetch an ambulance. The balaclava went leaping down the hill, skidding on broken bricks that skittered down in a minor avalanche, and knelt over the shaft. Will they need a stretcher? I called down. No, the foreman said, and I knew by the sound of his voice they were dead. Both of them? I said. Yes. I stood up. How did you know they were dead? I said, turning to look at Jack. How did... He wasn't there. I looked down the hill. The balaclava was nearly to the bottom, grabbing at a broken window sash to stop his headlong descent, his wake a smoky cloud of brick dust, but Jack was nowhere to be seen. It was nearly dawn. I could see the gray hills, and at the far end of them, the warden and his valuables. There was another rescue party on the 3rd hill over, still digging. I could see Swales handing down a bucket. Give a hand here, the foreman said impatiently, and hoisted the jack up to me. I hauled it over to the side, and then came back and helped the foreman out of the shaft. His hands were filthy, covered in reddish-brown mud. Was it the gas that killed them? I asked, even though he was already pulling out a packet of cigarettes. No, he said, shaking a cigarette out and taking it between his teeth. He patted the front of his coverall, leaving red stains. How long have they been dead? I asked. He found his matches, struck one, and lit the cigarette. Shortly after we last heard them, I should say, he said, and I thought, but they were already dead by then, and Jack knew it. They've been dead at least 2 hours. I looked at my watch. I read a little past 6. But the mine didn't kill them? He took the cigarette between his fingers and blew a long puff of smoke. When he put the cigarette back in his mouth, there was a red smear on it. Loss of blood. The next night, the Luftwaffe was early. I hadn't got much sleep after the incident. Morris had fretted about his son the whole day, and Swales had teased Renfrew mercilessly. Goring's found out about your spying, he said, and now he's sent his stukas after you. I finally went up to the 3rd floor and tried to sleep in the spotter's chair, but it was too light. The afternoon was cloudy, and the fires burning in the east end gave the sky a nasty reddish cast. Someone had left a copy of Twickenham's Twitterings on the floor. I read the article on The Walking Dead again, and then, still unable to sleep, the rest of the news sheet. There was an account of Hitler's invasion of Transylvania, and a recipe for butterless strawberry tart, and the account of the crime rate. London is currently the perfect place for the criminal element, Nelson was quoted as saying. We must constantly be on the lookout for wrongdoing. Below the recipe was a story about a Scottish terrier named Bonnie Charlie, who had barked and scrabbled wildly at the ruins of a collapsed house till wardens heeded his cries, dug down, and discovered 2 unharmed children. I must have fallen asleep reading that, because the next thing I knew, Morris was shaking me and telling me the sirens had gone. It was only 5 o'clock. At past, we had an HE in our sector. It was just 3 blocks from the post, and the walls shook and plaster rained down on Twickenham's typewriter and on Renfrew lying awake in his cot. Frivolity's my foot, Mrs. Lucy muttered as we dived for our tin hats. We need those reinforcing beams. The part-timers hadn't come on duty yet. Mrs. Lucy left Renfrew to send them on. We knew exactly where the incident was. Morris had been looking in that direction when it went, but we still had difficulty finding it. It was still evening, but by the time we had gone half a block, it was pitch black. The first time that had happened, I thought it was some sort of after-blindness from the blast, but it's only the brick and plaster dust from the collapsed buildings. It rises up in a haze that's darker than any blackout curtain, obscuring everything. When Mrs. Lucy set up shop on a stretch of pavement and switched on the blue incident light, it glowed spectrally in the man-made fog. Only 2 families still in the street, she said, holding the register up to the light. The Kirkcuddy family and the Hodgsons. Are they an old couple? Morris asked, appearing suddenly out of the fog. She peered at the register. Yes, pensioners. I found them, he said in that flat voice that meant they were dead. Blast. Oh dear, she said. The Kirkcuddys were a mother and 2 children. They live in Anderson shelter. She held the register closer to the blue light. Everyone else has been using the tube shelter. She unfolded a map and showed us where the Kirkcuddys' backyard had been, but it was no help. We spent the next hour wandering blindly over the mounds, listening for sounds that were impossible to hear over the Luftwaffe's comments and the ack-acks replies. Petersby showed up a little past 8, and Jack a few minutes later, and Mrs. Lucy sent them to wandering in the fog, too. Over here, Jack shouted almost immediately, and my heart gave an odd jerk. Oh, good, he's heard them, Mrs. Lucy said. Jack, go and find him. Over here, he called again, and I started off in the direction of his voice, almost afraid of what I would find, but I hadn't gone 10 steps before I could hear it, too. A baby crying, and a hollow, echoing sound like someone banging a fist against tin. Don't stop, Vi shouted. She was kneeling next to Jack in a shallow crater. Keep making noise, we're coming. She looked up at me. Tell Mrs. Lucy to ring the rescue squad. I blundered my way back to Mrs. Lucy through the darkness. She had already rung up the rescue squad. She sent me to Sloane Square to make sure the rest of the inhabitants of the block were safely there. The dust had lifted a little, but not enough for me to see where I was going. I pitched off a curb into the street and tripped over a pile of debris and then a body. When I shone my torch on it, I saw it was the girl I had walked to the shelter 2 nights before. She was sitting against the tiled entrance to the station, still holding a dress on a hanger in her limp hand. The old stew pot at John Lewis's never left her off even a minute before closing, and the Luftwaffe had been early. She had been killed by blast or by flying glass. Her face and neck and hands were covered with tiny cuts, and glass crunched underfoot when I moved her legs together. I went back to the incident and waited for the mortuary van and went with them to the shelter. It took me 3 hours to find the families on my list. By the time I got back to the incident, the rescue squad was 5 feet down. They're nearly there, Vi said, dumping a basket on the far side of the crater. All that's coming up now is dirt and the occasional rose bush. Where's Jack? I said. He went for a saw. She took the basket back and handed it to one of the rescue squad, who had to put his cigarette into his mouth to free his hands before he could take it. There was a board, but they dug past it. I leaned over the hole. I could hear the sound of banging, but not the baby. Are they still alive? She shook her head. We haven't heard the baby for an hour or so. We kept calling, but there's no answer. We're afraid the banging may be something mechanical. I wondered if they were dead, and Jack, knowing it, had not gone for a saw at all, but off to that day job of his. Swales came up. Guess who's in hospital, he said. Who? Vi said. Almwood. Nelson had his wardens out walking patrols during a raid, and he caught a piece of shrapnel from one of the axe in the leg. Nearly took it off. The rescue worker with a cigarette handed a heaping basket to Vi. She took it, staggering a little under the weight, and carried it off. You'd better not let Nelson see you working like that, Swales called after her, or he'll have you transferred to his sector. Where's Morris? He said, and went off, presumably to tell him, and whoever else he could find about Almwood. Jack came up, carrying the saw. They don't need it, the rescue worker said, and the cigarette dangling from the side of his mouth. I think I added an and in there that I didn't need to, processing what I'm saying. Whatever. It's cigarettes dangling from the side of his mouth. Mobile's here, he said, and went off for a cup of tea. Jack knelt and handed the saw down the hole. Are they still alive? I asked. Jack leaned over the hole, his hands clutching the edges. The banging was incredibly loud. It must have been deafening inside the Anderson. Jack stared into the hole as if he heard neither the banging nor my voice. He stood up, still looking to the hole. They're further to the left. How can they be further to the left, I thought. We can hear them. They're directly under us. Are they alive? I said. Yes. Swales came back. He's a spy. That's what he is, he said. Hitler sent him here to kill off our best men one by one. I told you. His name was Adolf von Nelson. The Kirkguddies were further to the left. The rescue squad had to widen the tunnel, cut the top of the Anderson open, and pry it back like opening a can of tomatoes. It took till 9 o'clock in the morning, but they were all alive. Jack left some time before it got light. I didn't see him go. Swales was telling me about Almwood's injury, and when I turned around, Jack was gone. Has Jack told you where this job of his is that he has to leave so early for? I asked Vi when I got back to the post. She had propped a mirror against one of the gas masks and was putting her hair up in pin curls. No, she said, dipping a comb in a glass of water and wetting a lock of her hair. Jack, could you reach me my bobby pins? I have a date this afternoon, and I want to look my best. I pushed the pins across to her. What sort of job is it? Did Jack say? No, some sort of war work, I should think. She wound a lock of hair around her finger. He's had 10 kills, 4 Stukas and 6 109s. I sat down next to Twickenham, who was typing up the incident report. Have you interviewed Jack yet? When would I have had time? Twickenham asked. We haven't had a quiet night since he came. Renfrew shuffled in from the other room. He had a blanket wrapped round him, Indian style, and a bed spread over his shoulders. He looked terrible, pale and drawn as a ghost. Would you like some breakfast? Vi asked, prying a pan open with her teeth. He shook his head. Did Nelson approve the reinforcements? No, Twickenham said, in spite of Vi's signaling him not to. You must tell Nelson it's an emergency, he said, hugging the blanket to him as if he were cold. I know why they're after me. It was before the war, when Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia. I wrote a letter to the Times. I was grateful Swales wasn't there. A letter to the Times. Come now, why don't you go and lie down for a bit, Vi said, securing a curl with a bobby pin as she stood up. You're tired, that's all, and that's what's getting you so worried. They don't even get the times over there. She took his arm. He went docilely with her into the other room. I heard him say, I called him a lowland bully in the letter. The person suffering from severe sleep loss, hearing voices, seeing visions, or believing fantastical things. Has he mentioned what sort of day job he has? I asked Twickenham. Who? He asked, still typing. Jack. No, but whatever it is, let's hope he's as good at it as he is at finding bodies. He stopped and peered at what he'd just typed. This makes 5, doesn't it? 5 came back, and we'd best not let Von Nelson find out about it, she said. She sat down and dipped the comb into the glass of water. He'd take him like he took Almwood, and we're already short-handed, with Renfrew the way he is. Mrs. Lucy came in carrying the incident light, disappeared into the pantry with it, and came out again carrying an application form. Might I use the typewriter, Mr. Twickenham? She asked. He pulled his sheet of paper out of the typewriter and stood up. Mrs. Lucy sat down, rolled in the form, and began typing. I've decided to apply directly to civil defense for reinforcements, she said. What sort of day job does Jack have? I asked her. War work, she said. She pulled the application out, turned it over, rolled it back in. Jack, would you mind taking this over to headquarters? Work stays, Vi said, making a pin curl on the back of her head. Raids every night. When does he sleep? I don't know, I said. He'd best be careful, she said, or he'll turn into one of the walking dead, like Renfrew. Mrs. Lucy signed the application form, folded it in half, and gave it to me. I took it to Civil Defense Headquarters and spent half a day trying to find the right office to give it to. It's not the correct form, the 6th girl said. She needs to file an A114 exterior improvements. It's not exterior, I said. The post is applying for reinforcing beams for the cellar. Reinforcements are classified as exterior improvements, she said. She handed me the form, which looked identical to the one Mrs. Lucy had already filled out, and I left. On the way out, Nelson stopped me. I thought he was going to tell me my uniform was a disgrace again, but instead he pointed to my tin hat and demanded, Why aren't you wearing a regulation helmet, Warden? All ARP wardens shall wear a helmet with the letter W in red on the front, he quoted. I took my hat off and looked at it. The red W had partially chipped away so that it looked like a V. What post are you? He barked. 48, Chelsea, I said, and wondered if he expected me to salute. Mrs. Lucy is your warden, he said disgustedly, and I expected his next question to be what I was doing at Civil Defense, but instead he said, I heard about Colonel Godalming. Your post has been having good luck locating casualties these last few raids. Yes, sir, was obviously the wrong answer, and no, sir, would make him suspicious. We found 3 people in an Anderson last night, I said. One of the children had the wits to bang the roof with a pair of pliers. I've heard that the person finding them is a new man, Settle. He sounded friendly, almost jovial, like Hitler at Munich. Settle, I said blankly. Mrs. Lucy was the one who found the Anderson. Morris's son Quincy's surprise was the Victoria Cross. A medal, he said over and over. Who'd have thought it? My Quincy with a medal. 15 planes he shot down. It had been presented at a special ceremony at Quincy's commanding officer's headquarters, and the Duchess of York herself had been there. Morris had pinned the medal on himself. I wore my suit, he told us for the 100th time. In case he was in trouble, I wanted to make a good impression, and a good thing, too. What would the Duchess of York have thought if I'd gone looking like this? He looked pretty bad. We all did. We'd had 2 bread baskets of incendiaries, one right after the other, and Vi had been on watch. We had to save the butchers again, and the bakers 2 blocks further down, and a 13th century crucifix. I told him it went through the altar roof, Vi had said disgustedly when she and I finally got it out. Your friend Jack couldn't find an incendiary if it fell on him. You told Jack the incendiary came down to the church? I said, looking up at the carved wooden figure. The bottom of the cross was blackened, and Christ's nailed feet, as if he had been burned at the stake instead of crucified. Yes, she said. I even told him it was the altar. She looked back up the nave, and he could have seen it as soon as he came into the church. What did he say? That it wasn't there? Vi was looking speculatively up at the roof. It could have been caught in the rafters and come down after. Okay, need a break. But we're getting to the end. No, we're not. Oh, dear Lord. Oh, I knew this was a long one. It's 18 pages. 18 pages. feel like I've lost track of how many pages this story is, like 4 times. It was like 50, wasn't it? It was 50, but I somehow convinced myself it was 30 in the middle. At least we're over halfway. Okay, there's a church. There's a cross somewhere stuck. Vi was looking speculatively up at the roof. It could have been caught in the rafters and come down after. It hardly matters, does it? We put it out. Come on, let's get back to the post, she said, shivering. I'm freezing. I was freezing too. We were both sopping wet. The AFS had stormed up after we had the fire under control and sprayed everything in sight with icy water. Pinned it on myself, I did, Morris said. The Duchess of York kissed him on both cheeks and said he was the pride of England. He had brought a bottle of wine to celebrate the cross. He got Renfrew up and brought him to the table, draped in his blankets, and ordered Twickenham to put his typewriter away. Petersby brought in extra chairs, and Mrs. Lucy went upstairs to get her crystal. Only 8, I'm afraid, she said, coming down with the stemmed goblets in her blackened hands. The Germans have broken the rest. Who's willing to make do with the tooth glass? I don't care for any, thank you, Jack said. I don't drink. What's that? Morris said jovially. He had taken off his tin helmet, and below the white line it left, he looked like he was wearing blackface in a music hall show. Fuck. You've got to toast my boy at least. Just imagine. My Quincy with a medal. Mrs. Lucy rinsed out the porcelain tooth glass and handed it to Vi, who was pouring out the wine. They passed the goblets round. Jack took the tooth glass. To my son Quincy, the best pilot in the RAF, Morris said, raising his goblet. May he shoot down the entire Luftwaffe, Swales shouted, and put an end to this freaking war, so a man can get a decent night's sleep, Renfrew said, and everyone laughed. We drank. Jack raised his glass with the others, but when Vi took the bottle round again, he put his hand over the mouth of it. Just think of it, Morris said. My son Quincy with a medal. He had his troubles in school, in with a bad lot, problems with the police. I worried about him, I did. Wondered what he'd come to, and when this war comes along, and here he is a hero. And then this war comes along, and here he is a hero. 2 heroes, Petersby said. We drank again, and Vi dribbled out the last of the wine into Morris's glass. That's the lot, I'm afraid. She brightened. I have a bottle of cherry cordial Charlie gave me. Mrs. Lucy made a face. Just a minute, she said, disappeared into the pantry, and came back with 2 cobwebbed bottles of port, which she poured out generously and a little sloppily. The presence of intoxicating beverages on post is strictly forbidden, she said. A fine of 5 shillings will be imposed for a first offense, £1 for subsequent offenses. She took out a pound note and laid it on the table. I wonder what Nelson was before the war. A monster, Vi said. I looked across at Jack. He still had his hand over his glass. A headmaster, Swales said. No, I've got it. An inland revenue collector. Everyone laughed. I was a horrid person before the war, Mrs. Lucy said. Vi giggled. I was a deaconess. One of those dreadful women who arranges the flowers in the sanctuary and gets up jumble sales and bullies the rector. The terror of the church wardens. That's what I used to be. I was determined that they should put the hymnals front side out on the backs of the pews. Morris knows. He sang in the choir. It's true, Morris said. She used to instruct the choir on the proper way to line up. I tried to imagine her as a stickler, as a petty tyrant like Nelson, and failed. Sometimes it takes something dreadful like a war for one to find one's proper job, she said, staring at her glass. To the war, Swales said gaily. I'm not sure we should toast something so terrible as that, Twickenham said, doubtfully. It isn't all that terrible, Vi said. I mean, without it, we wouldn't all be here together, would we? And you'd never have met all those pilots of yours, would you, Vi? Swales said. There's nothing wrong with making the best of a bad job, Vi said, miffed. Some people do more than that, Swales said. Some people take positive advantage of the war, like Colonel Godalming. Godalming, I don't know. I had a word with one of the AFS volunteers. Seems the colonel didn't come back for his hunting rifle after all. He leaned forward confidingly. Seems he was having a bit on with a blonde dancer from the windmill. Seems his wife thought he was out shooting grouse in Surrey, and now she's asking all sorts of unpleasant questions. He's not the only one taking advantage, Morris said. The night you got the Kirkcuddies out, Jack, I found an old couple killed by blast. I put them by the road for the mortuary van, and later I saw somebody over there, bending over the bodies, doing something to him. I thought, he must be straightening them out before the rigor sets in, but then it comes to me. He's robbing them. Dead bodies. And who's to say they were killed by blast, Swales said. Who's to say they weren't murdered? There's lots of bodies, aren't there? And nobody looks close at them. Who's to say they were all killed by the Germans? How did we get onto this? Petersby said. We're supposed to be celebrating Quincy Morris's medal, not talking about murderers. He raised his glass. To Quincy Morris and the RAF, I said. To making the best of a bad job, Mrs. Lucy said. Here, here, Jack said softly, and raised his glass, but he still didn't drink. It sounds like this guy just has a crush on Jack and doesn't know how to deal with it. Sometimes somebody just catches your attention and you aren't sure why. Jack found 4 people in the next 3 days. I did not hear any of them until well after we had started digging. And the last one, a fat woman in striped pajamas and a pink hairnet, I never did hear, though she said when we brought her up that she had called and called between prayers. Twickenham wrote it all up for the Twitterings, tossing out the article on Quincy Morris's medal and typing up a new master's. When Mrs. Lucy borrowed the typewriter to fill out the A114, she said, "What's this?" "My lead story," he said. "Settle finds 4 in rubble." He handed her the master's. Jack Settle, the newest addition to Post 48, she read. "Located 4 air raid victims last night." "It wanted to be useful," says the modest Mr. Settle, when asked why he came to London from Yorkshire. "When he's been useful since his very first night on the job when she handed it back to him. Sorry, you can't print that. Nelson's been nosing about asking questions. He's already taken one of my wardens and nearly got him killed. I won't let him have another." "That's censorship," Twickenham said, outraged. "There's a war on," Mrs. Lucy said, "and we're short-handed. I've relieved Mr. Renfrew of duty. He's going to stay with his sister in Birmingham, and I wouldn't let Nelson have another one of my wardens if we were overstaffed. He's already got Almwood nearly killed." She handed me the A114 and asked me to take it to civil defense. I did. The girl I had spoken to wasn't there, and the girl who was said, "This is for interior improvements. You need to fill out a D268. I did, I said, and I was told that reinforcements qualified as exterior improvements. Only if they're on the outside. She handed me a D268. "Sorry," she said apologetically. "I'd help you if I could, but my boss is a stickler for the correct forms. There's something else you can do for me," I said. "I was supposed to take one of our part-timers a message at his date." Okay. Nope. Whew. We're gonna make it through this, and we're gonna find the frigging vampire. Okay. "There's something else you can do for me," I said. "I was supposed to take one of our part-timers a message at his day job, but I've lost the address. If you could look it up for me?" Jack Settle? "If not, I've got to go all the way back to Chelsea to get it." She looked back over her shoulder and then said, "Wait a mo," and darted down the hall. She came back with a sheet of paper. "Settle?" she said. "Post 48, Chelsea?" "That's the one," I said. "I need his work address." "He hasn't got one." "You had left the incident while we were still getting the fat woman out. It was starting to get light. We had a rope under her and a makeshift winch, and he had abruptly handed his end to Swales and said, 'I've got to leave for my day job.'" "You're certain?" I said. "I'm certain." She handed me the sheet of paper. It was Jack's approval for employment as a part-time warden, signed by Mrs. Lucy. The spaces for work and home addresses had been left blank. "This is all there was in the file," she said. "No work permit, no identity card, not even a ration card. We keep copies of all of that, so he must not have a job." I took the D268 back to the post, but Mrs. Lucy wasn't there. One of Nelson's wardens came round with a new regulation, Twickenham said, running off copies on the duplicating machine. "All wardens will be out on patrol unless on telephone or spotter duty. All wardens." She went off to give him what for, he said, sounding pleased. He was apparently over his anger at her for censoring his story on Jack. I picked up one of the still wet copies of the news sheet. The lead story was about Hitler's invasion of Greece. He had put the article about Quincy Morris's medal down in the right-hand corner under a list of what the war has done for us. Number 1 was, it made us discover capabilities we didn't know we had. She called him a murderer, Twickenham said. A murderer? What did you want to tell her? Twickenham said. That Jack doesn't have a job, I thought, or a ration card. That he didn't put out the incendiary in the church, even though Vi told him it had gone through the altar roof. That he knew the Anderson was further to the left. It's still the wrong form, I said, taking out the D268. That's easily remedied, he said. He rolled the application into the typewriter, typed for a few minutes, handed it back to me. Mrs. Lucy has to sign it, I said, and he snatched it back, whipped out a fountain pen, and signed her name. What were you before the war? I asked. A forger? You'd be surprised. He handed the form back to me. You look dreadful, Jack. Have you got any sleep this last week? If anyone watching this now or watching this back is still awake, bro. Oh my god, it's still going. I just want a vampire, please. Ah. I lost track of where I was. You look dreadful, Jack. Have you got any sleep this last week? When would I have had the chance? Why don't you lie down now while no one's here, he said, reaching for my arm the way Vi had reached for Renfrew's. I'll take the form back to civil defense for you. I shook off his arm. I'm all right. I walked back to civil defense. The girl who had tried to find Jack's file wasn't there, and the first girl was. I was sorry I hadn't brought the A114 along as well, but she scrutinized the form without comment and stamped the back. It will take approximately 6 weeks to process. 6 weeks, I said. Hitler could have invaded the entire empire by then. In that case, you'll very likely have to file a different form. I didn't go back to the post. Mrs. Lucy would doubtless be back by the time I returned. But what could I say to her? I suspect Jack. Of what? Of not liking lamb chops and cake, of having to leave early for work, of rescuing children from the rubble. He had said he had a job, and the girl couldn't find his work permit. But it took the civil defense 6 weeks to process a request for a few beams. It would probably take them till the end of the war to file the work permits. Or perhaps his had been in the file and the girl had missed it. Loss of sleep can result in mistakes on the job, and odd fixations. I walked to Sloane Square Station. There was no sign of where the young woman had been. They had even swept the glass up. Her stew pot of a boss at John Lewis's never let her go till closing time, even if the sirens had gone, even if it was dark. She had had to hurry through the blacked-out streets all alone, carrying her dress for the next day on a hanger, listening to the guns and trying to make out how far off the planes were. If someone had been stalking her, she would never have heard him, never have seen him in the darkness. Whoever found her would think she had been killed by flying glass. He doesn't eat, I would say to Mrs. Lucy. He doesn't put out an incendiary in a church. He always leaves the incidents before dawn, even when we don't have the casualties up. The Luftwaffe was trying to kill me. It was a letter I wrote to the Times. The walking dead may hallucinate, hearing voices, seeing visions, or believing fantastical things. The sirens went. I must have been standing there for hours, staring at the pavement. I went back to the post. Mrs. Lucy was there. You look dreadful, Jack. How long's it been since you've slept? I don't know, I said. Where's Jack? On watch, Mrs. Lucy said. You'd best be careful, Vi said, setting chocolates on a plate, or you'll turn into one of the walking dead. Would you like a sweet? Eddie gave them to me. The telephone pipped. Mrs. Lucy answered it, spoke a minute, hung up. Slaney needs help on an instant, she said. They've asked for Jack. She sent both of us. We found the incident without any trouble. There was no dust cloud, no smell except from a fire burning off to one side. This didn't just happen, I said. It's a day old at least. I was wrong. It was 2 days old. The rescue squads had been working straight through, and there were still at least 30 people unaccounted for. Some of the rescue squad were digging half-heartedly halfway up a mound, but most of them were standing about, smoking, and looking like they were casualties themselves. Jack went up to where the men were digging, shook his head, and set off across the mound. Heard you had a body sniffer. one of the smokers said to me. They've got one in Whitechapel, too. Crawls round the incident on his hands and knees, sniffing like a bloodhound. Yours do that? No, I said. Over here, Jack said. Says he can read their minds, the one in Whitechapel does, he said, putting out his cigarette and taking up a pickaxe. He clambered up the slope to where Jack was already digging. It was easy to see because of the fire, and fairly easy to dig, but halfway down we struck the massive headboard of a bed. We'll have to go in from the side, Jack said. The hell with that, the man who told me about the body sniffer said. How do you know somebody's down there? I don't hear anything. Jack didn't answer him. He moved down the slope and began digging into its side. They've been in there for 2 days, the man said. They're dead, and I'm not getting overtime. He flung down the pickaxe and stalked off to the mobile canteen. Jack didn't even notice he was gone. He handed me baskets, and I emptied them, and occasionally Jack said saw or tin snips, and I handed them to him. I was off getting the stretcher when he brought her out. She was perhaps 13. She was wearing a white nightgown, or perhaps it only looked white because of the plaster dust. Jack's face was ghastly with it. He had picked her up in his arms, and she had fastened her arms around his neck and buried her face against his shoulders. They were both outlined by the fire. I brought the stretcher up, and Jack knelt down and tried to lay her on it, but she would not let go of his neck. It's all right, he said urgently. You're safe now. He unclasped her hands and folded them on her chest. Her nightgown was streaked with dried blood, but it didn't seem to be hers. I wondered who else had been in there with her. What's your name? Jack said. Mina, she said. It was no more than a whisper. My name's Jack, he said. He nodded at me. So's his. We're going to carry you down to the ambulance now. Don't be afraid. You're safe now. The ambulance wasn't there yet. We laid the stretcher on the pavement and I went over to the incident officer to see if it was on its way. Before I could get back, somebody shouted, "Here's another," and I went and helped dig out a hand that the foreman had found, and then the body was all the blood had come from. When I looked down the hill, the girl was still lying there on the stretcher, and Jack was bending over it. I went out to Whitechapel to see the body sniffer the next day. He wasn't there. He's a part-timer, the post warden told me, clearing off a chair so I could sit down. The post was a mess, dirty clothes and dishes everywhere. An old woman in a print wrapper was frying up kidneys in a skillet. Works days and munitions out to Dorking, she said. How exactly is he able to locate the bodies? I asked. I heard that he reads their minds, the woman said. She scraped the kidneys onto a plate and handed it to the post warden. He's heard it too, more's the pity, and it's gone straight to his head. I can feel them under here, he says to the rescue squads, like he was Houdini or something, and points to where they're supposed to start digging. Then how does he find them? Luck, the warden said. I think he smells them, the woman said. That's why they call them body sniffers. The warden snorted. Over the stink the Jerry's put in the bombs and the gas and all the rest of it. If he were, I said and didn't finish it. If he had an acute sense of smell, perhaps he could smell the blood. You can't even smell the bodies when they've been dead a week, the warden said, his mouth full of kidneys. He hears them screaming, same as us. He's got better hearing than us, the woman said, switching happily to his theory. Most of us are half deaf from the guns, and he isn't. I hadn't been able to hear the fat woman in the pink hairnet, although she'd said she had called for help. But Jack, just down from Yorkshire, where they hadn't been deafened by anti-aircraft guns for weeks, could. There was nothing sinister about it. Some people had better hearing than others. We pulled an army colonel out last week who claimed he didn't cry out, I said. He's lying, the warden said, sawing at a kidney. We had a nanny 2 days ago. Prim and proper as you please. Swore the whole time he was getting her out. Words to make a sailor blush, and then claimed she didn't. Unclean words have never crossed my lips and never will, she says to me. He brandished his fork at me. Your colonel cried out all right. He just won't admit it. I didn't make a sound, Colonel Godalming had said, brandishing his serving spoon. Knew it wouldn't do any good. And perhaps the warden was right, and it was only bluster. But he hadn't wanted his wife to know he was in London, to find out about the dancer at the windmill. He had had good reason to keep silent, to try to dig himself out. I went home and rang up a girl I knew in the ambulance service and asked her to find out where they had taken Mina. She rang me back with the answer in a few minutes, and I took the tube over to St. George's Hospital. The others had all cried out or banged on the roof of the Anderson, except Mina. She had been so frightened when Jack got her out she couldn't speak above a whisper, and that didn't mean she hadn't cried or whimpered. But that didn't mean she hadn't cried or whimpered. When you were buried last night, did you call for help? I would ask her, and she would answer me in her mouse voice. I called and called between prayers. Why? And I would say, it's nothing, an odd fixation brought on by lack of sleep. Jack spends his days in Dorking at a munitions plant and has exceptionally acute hearing. And there is no more truth to my theory than to Renfrew's belief that the raids were brought on by a letter to the Times. Okay. We're gonna get through this story. St. George's had an entrance marked Casualty Clearing Station. I asked the nursing sister behind the desk if I could see Mina. She was brought in last night, the James Street incident. She looked at a penciled and crossed over roster. I don't show an admission by that name. I'm certain she was brought here, I said, twisting my head round to read the list. There isn't another St. George's, is there? She shook her head and lifted up the roster to look at a second sheet. Here she is, she said, and I had heard the rescue squads use that tone of voice often enough to know what it meant. But that was impossible. She had been under that headboard. The blood on her nightgown hadn't even been hers. I'm so sorry, the sister said. When did she die? I said. This morning, she said, checking the second list, which was much longer than the first. Did anyone else come to see her? I don't know. I've just been on since 11. What did she die of? She looked at me as if I were insane. What was the listed cause of death? I asked. She had to find Mina's name on the roster again. Shock due to loss of blood, she said, and I thanked her and went to find Jack. He found me. I had gone back to the post and waited till everyone was asleep and Mrs. Lucy had gone upstairs and then sneaked into the pantry to look up Jack's address and Mrs. Lucy's files. It had not been there, but as I had known it wouldn't, and if there had been an address, what would it have turned out to be when I went to find it? A gutted house, a mound of rubble. I had gone to Sloane Square Station, knowing he wouldn't be there, but having no other place to look. He could have been anywhere. London was full of empty houses, bombed-out cellars, secret places to hide until it got dark. That was why he had come here. If I was a bad un, I'd come straight to London, Swales had said. But the criminal element weren't the only ones who had come, drawn by the blackout and the easy pickings and the bodies, drawn by the blood. I stood there until it started to get dark, watching two boys scrabble in the gutter for candy that had been blown out of a confectioner's front window, and then walked back to a doorway down the street from the post, where I could see the door, and waited. The sirens went. Swales left on patrol. Petersby went in. Morse came out, stopping to peer at the skies if he were looking for his son Quincy. Mrs. Lucy must not have managed to talk Nelson out of the patrols. It got dark. The searchlights began to crisscross the sky, catching the silver of the barrage balloons. Barrage balloons? The planes started coming in from the east, a low hum. Vi hurried in, wearing high heels and carrying a box tied with string. Petersby and Twickenham left on patrol. Vi came out, fastening her helmet strap under her chin and eating something. I've been looking for you everywhere, Jack said. I turned around. He had driven up in a lorry marked ATS. He had left the door open and the motor running. I've got the beams, he said, for reinforcing the post. The incident we were on last night, all those beams were lying on top, and I asked the owner of the house if I could buy them from him. He gestured to the back of the lorry, where jagged ends of wood were sticking out. Come along, then. We can get them up tonight if we hurry. He started towards the truck. Where were you? I looked everywhere for you. I went to St. George's Hospital, I said. He stopped, his hand on the open door of the truck. Mina's dead, I said. But you knew that, didn't you? He didn't say anything. The nurse said she died of loss of blood, I said. A flare drifted down, lighting his face with a deadly whiteness. I know what you are. If we hurry, we can get the reinforcements up before the raid starts, he said. He started to pull the door to. I put my hand on it to keep him from closing it. War work, I said bitterly. What do? Make sure you are alone in the tunnel with them, or go to see them in hospital afterwards? He let go of the door. Brilliant stroke. Volunteering for the ARP, I said. Nobody's going to suspect the noble air raid warden, especially when he's so good at locating casualties. And if some of those casualties die later, if somebody's found dead on the street after a raid, well, it's only to be expected. There's a war on. The drone overhead got suddenly louder, and a whole shower of flares came down. The searchlights wheeled, trying to find the planes. Jack took hold of my arm. "Get down," he said, and tried to drag me into the doorway. I shook his arm off. "I'd kill you if I could," I said, "but I can't, can I?" I waved my hand at the sky, "and neither can they. Your sort don't die, do they?" There was a long swish and the rising scream. "I will kill you, though," I shouted over it, "if you touch Vi or Mrs. Lucy." "Mrs. Lucy," he said, and I couldn't tell if he said it with astonishment or contempt. "Or Vi, or any of the rest of them. I'll drive a stake through your heart, or whatever it takes," I said, and the air fell apart. There was a long sound like an enormous monster growling. It seemed to go on and on. I tried to put my hands over my ears, but I had to hang on to the road to keep from falling. The roar became a scream, and the pavement shook itself sharply, and I fell off. "Are you all right?" Jack said. I was sitting next to the lorry, which was on its side. The beams had spilled out the back. "Were we hit?" I said. "No," he said, and I already knew that, and before he had finished pulling me to my feet, I was running towards the post that we couldn't see for the dust. Mrs. Lucy had told Nelson having everyone out on patrol would mean no one could be found in an emergency, but that was not true. They were all there within minutes. Swales and Morris and Violet, clattering up in her high heels, and Petersby. They ran up, one after the other, and then stopped and looked stupidly at the space that had been Mrs. Lucy's house, as if they couldn't make out what it was. "Where's Renfrew?" Jack said. "In Birmingham," Vi said. He wasn't here," I explained. "He's on sick leave." I peered through the smoke and dust, trying to see their faces. "Where's Twickenham?" "Here," he said. "Where's Mrs. Lucy?" I said. "Over there," Jack said, and pointed down into the rubble. We dug all night. 2 different rescue squads came to help. They called down every half hour, but there was no answer. Vi borrowed a light from somewhere, draped a blue headscarf over it, and set up as incident officer. Okay. An ambulance came, sat a while, left to go to another incident, came back. Nelson took over as incident officer, and Vi came back up to help. "Is she alive?" She asked. "She'd better be," I said, looking at Jack. It began to mist. The planes came over again, dropping flares and incendiaries, but no one stopped work. Twickenham's typewriter came up in the baskets, and one of Mrs. Lucy's wine glasses. It began to get light. Jack looked vaguely up at the sky. "Don't even think about it," I said. "You're not going anywhere." Imagine having a friend who's a vampire and you're like, "I know the sun is coming up. You can't leave." At around 3, Morris thought he heard something, and we stopped and called down, and there was no answer. The mist turned into a drizzle, and at 4:30, I shouted to Mrs. Lucy, and she called back from far underground, "I'm here." "Are you all right?" I shouted. "My legs hurt. I think it's broken," she shouted, her voice calm. I seemed to be under the table. "Don't worry," I shouted. "We're nearly there." The drizzle turned the plaster dust into a slippery, disgusting mess. We had to brace the tunnel repeatedly and cover it with a tarpaulin, and then it was too dark to see to dig. Swales lay above us, holding a pocket torch over our heads so we could see. The all clear went. "Jack," Mrs. Lucy called up. "Yes?" I shouted. "Was that the all clear?" "Yes," I shouted. "Don't worry, we'll have you out soon now. What time is it?" It was too dark in the tunnel to see my watch. I made a guess. A little after 5. "Is Jack there?" "Yes." "He mustn't stay," she said. "Tell him to go home." The rain stopped. We ran into one and then another of the oak beams that had reinforced the landing on the 4th floor and had to saw through them. Swales reported that Morris had called Nelson a bloody murderer. Vi brought us paper cups of tea. We called down to Mrs. Lucy, but there wasn't any answer. "She's probably dozed off," Twickenham said, and the others nodded as if they believed him. We could smell the gas long before we got to her, but Jack kept on digging, and like the others, I told myself that she was all right, that we would get to her in time. She was not under the table after all, but under part of the pantry door. We had to call for a jack to get it off her. It took Morris a long time to come back with it, but it didn't matter. She was lying perfectly straight, her arms folded across her chest, and her eyes closed as if she were asleep. Her left leg had been taken off at the knee. Jack knelt beside her and cradled her head. "Keep your hands off her." I made Swales come down and help get her out. Vi and Twickenham put her on the stretcher. Petersby went for the ambulance. She was never a horrid person, you know, Morris said. Never. It began to rain again, the sky so dark it was impossible to tell whether the sun had come up yet or not. Swales brought a tarp to cover Mrs. Lucy. Petersby came back. The ambulance has gone off again, he said. I've sent for the mortuary van, but they said they doubt they can be here before 8:30. I looked at Jack. He was standing over the tarp, his hands slackly at his sides. He looked worse than Renfrew ever had, impossibly tired, his face gray with wet plaster dust. We'll wait, I said. There's no point in all of us standing here in the rain for 2 hours, Morris said. I'll wait here, Jack. He turned to him. Go and report to Nelson. I'll do it, Vi said. Jack needs to get to his day job. Is she up? Nelson said. He clambered over the 4th floor beams to where we were standing. Is she dead? He glared at Morris and then at my hat, and I wondered if he were going to reprimand me for the condition of my uniform. Which of you found her? He demanded. I looked at Jack. Settle did, I said. He's a regular wonder. He's found 6 this week alone. Damn. Okay. 2 days after Mrs. Lucy's funeral, a memo came through from Civil Defense transferring Jack to Nelson's post, and I got my official notice to report for duty. I was sent to basics training and then on to Portsmouth? Vi sent me food packets, and Twickenham posted me copies of his twitterings. The post had relocated across the street from the butcher's in a house belonging to a Miss Arthur, who had subsequently joined the post. Miss Arthur loves knitting and flower arranging and will make a valuable addition to our brave little band, Twickenham had written. Vi had got engaged to a pilot in the Rath. Hitler had bombed Birmingham. Jack and Nelson's post now had saved 16 people in 1 week, a record for the ARP. After 2 weeks, I was shipped to North Africa out of the reach of the mails. When I finally got Morris's letter, it was 3 months old. Jack had been killed while rescuing a child at an incident. A delayed action bomb had fallen nearby, but that bloody murderer Nelson had refused to allow the rescue squad to evacuate. The DA had gone off. The tunnel Jack was working in had collapsed and he'd been killed. They had got the child out, though, and she was unhurt except for a few cuts. If he isn't dead, I thought. It's impossible to kill him. But he isn't dead, I thought. It's impossible to kill him. I had tried, but even betraying him to Von Nelson hadn't worked, and he was still somewhere in London, hidden by the blackout and the noise of the bombs and the number of dead bodies, and who would notice a few more. In January, I helped take out a tank battalion at Tobruk. I killed 9 Germans before I caught a piece of shrapnel. I was shipped to Gibraltar. Why can't I say this? Gibraltar? To hospital, where the rest of my mail caught up with me. Vi had got married. The raids had let up considerably. Jack had been awarded the George Cross posthumously. In March, I was sent back to hospital in England for surgery. It was near North Weald, where Morris's son Quincy was stationed. He came to see me after the surgery. He looked the very picture of a RAF pilot. Firm-jawed, steely-eyed, rakish grin, not at all like a delinquent miner. He was flying nightly bombing missions over Germany, he told me, giving Hitler a bit of our own back. I hear you're to get a medal, he said, looking at the wall above my head as if he expected to see violets painted there, 9 of them, 1 for each kill. I asked him about his father. He was fine, he told me. He'd been appointed senior warden. I admire you ARP people, he said, saving lives and all that. He meant it. He was flying nightly bombing missions over Germany, reducing their cities to rubble, creating incidents for their air raid wardens to scrabble through looking for dead children. I wondered if they had body sniffers there, too, and if they were monsters like Jack. Dad wrote to me about your friend Jack, Quincy said. It must have been rough, hearing so far away from home and all that. He looked genuinely sympathetic, and I supposed he was. He had shot down 28 planes and killed who knows how many fat women in hairnets and 13-year-old girls, but no one had ever thought to call him a monster. The Duchess of York had called him the pride of England and kissed him on both cheeks. I went with Dad to Vi Westren's wedding, he said. Pretty as a picture she was. I thought of Vi, with her pin curls and her plain face. It was as though the war had transformed her into someone completely different, someone pretty and sought after. There were strawberries and 2 kinds of cake, he said. One of the wardens, Tottenham, read a poem in honor of the happy couple, wrote it himself. It was as if the war had transformed Twickenham as well, and Mrs. Lucy, who had been the terror of the church wardens. What the war has done for us, but it hadn't transformed them. All that was wanted was for someone to give Vi a bit of attention for all her latent sweetness to blossom. Every girl is pretty when she knows she's sought after. Twickenham had always longed to be a writer. Nelson had always been a bully and a stickler, and Mrs. Lucy, in spite of what she said, had never been either. Sometimes it takes something dreadful like a war for one to find one's proper job, she'd said. Like Quincy, who had been, in spite of what Morris said, a bad boy, headed for a life of petty crime or worse, when the war came along, and suddenly his wildness and daring and high spirits were virtues, were just what was needed. What the war has done for us, number 2, it has made jobs that didn't exist before, like post warden, like body sniffer. Did they find Jack's body, I asked, though I knew the answer. No, Quincy would say. We couldn't find it, or there was nothing left. Didn't Dad tell you? Quincy said, with an anxious look at the transfusion bag hanging above the bed. They had to dig past him to get to the little girl. It was pretty bad, Dad said. The blast from the DA had driven the leg of a chair straight through his chest. So I had killed him after all, Nelson and Hitler and me. I shouldn't have told you that, Quincy said, watching the blood drip from the bag into my veins as if it were a bad sign. I know he was a friend of yours. I wouldn't have told you, only Dad said to tell you yours was the last name he said before he died, just before the DA went up. Jack, he said, like he knew what was going to happen, Dad said, and called out your name. Gay. Oh, he had a crush back. Okay. He didn't, though, I thought, and that bloody murderer Nelson hadn't refused to evacuate him. Jack had just gone on working, oblivious to Nelson and the DA, stabbing at the rubble as though he were trying to murder it, calling out saw and wire cutters and braces, calling out Jack. Oblivious to everything except getting them out before the gas killed them, before they bled to death. Oblivious to everything but his job. I had been wrong about why he had joined the ARP, about why he had come to London. He must have lived a terrible life up there in Yorkshire, full of darkness and self-hatred and killing. When the war came, when he began reading of people buried in the rubble, of rescue wardens searching blindly for them, it must have seemed a godsend, a blessing. It wasn't, I think, that he was trying to atone for what he'd done, for what he was. It's impossible, at any rate. I had only killed 10 people, counting Jack, and had helped rescue nearly 20, but it doesn't cancel out. And I don't think that was what he wanted. What he wanted was to be useful. Here's to making the best of a bad job, Mrs. Lucy had said, and that was all any of them had been doing. Swales with his jokes and gossip, and Twickenham and Jack, and if they found friendship or love or atonement as well, it was no less than they deserved, and it was still a bad job. I should be going, Quincy said, looking worriedly at me. You need your rest, and I need to be getting back to work. The German army's halfway to Cairo, and Yugoslavia's joined the Axis. He looked excited, happy. You must rest and get well. We need you back in this war. I'm glad you came, I said. Yes, well, Dad wanted me to tell you that about Jack calling for you. He stood up. Tough luck. You're getting it in the nick like this. He slapped his flight cap against his leg. I hate this war, he said, but he was lying. So do I. They'll have you back killing Jerry's in no time, he said. Yes. He put his cap on at a rakish angle and went off to bomb lecherous retired colonels and children and widows who had not yet managed to get reinforcing beams out of the Hamburg civil defense and paint violets on his plane, doing his bit. His sister brought in a tray. She had a large red cross sewn to the bib of her apron. No thanks. I'm not hungry, I said. You must keep your strength up, she said. She set the tray beside the bed and went out. The war's been rather a blessing for our Vi, I had told Jack. And perhaps it was. But not for most people. Not for girls who worked at John Lewis's for old stewpots, who never let them leave early even when the sirens had gone. Not for those people who discovered hidden capabilities for insanity or betrayal or bleeding to death or murder. The sirens went. The nurse came in to check my transfusion and take the tray away. I lay there for a long time, watching the blood come down into my arm. Jack, I said. and didn't know who I called out to, or if I had made a sound. Oof. God, that was a long one. Was Jack by Connie Willis. And that was a very long story. Okay. Thoughts. It's interesting. I dabble a little bit in writing, but I also more often just read. And one thing I heard somewhere along the way was that, like, when we read the story, that's, like, say it's a romance, right? There's the main character, but then there's the love interest. And you would think, because of the main character's point of view's focus being on their love interest, that the writers, they're writing how they feel, like they're writing flowery things about this one character, and that must be the character they also care for the most or something, you know. But the reality is that a lot of your love goes into the point of view character. So I was reading this, like, we're supposed to be staring at this other Jack, which, hey, I tip my hat to you for the ending being a bit of a mirror, and the mirroring with the names. I tip my hat to you. That was fun. That was good writing. I think this was really well written. I was kind of complaining at the beginning. I kind of lost my point. What was my point? Just that, like, we're watching through this point of view at this other Jack, this supposed monster doing supposedly monstrous things. But I'm looking at it like, why do you believe that this guy is a monster? Like, yeah, all of the reasons you have every time you change your mind seem like pretty solid reasons to not believe that he's a monster. I didn't really think this through very hard. I don't know if I'm talking in circles, but I really like the main character's point of view. I was wondering where his personality is, though. He's a lot more like, like everybody else talks and moves around him, and then, like, he does things in the background a little bit here and there. So it was really interesting to get to the end and have him have this, like, revelation about human beings and war and humanity, and don't knock the camera over. Oh no, it immediately stopped working. Oh my god, my cat. Is it back? It's back. Whatever. I enjoyed it. It wasn't what I was expecting. I really like the ending. It was kind of long, though. But it is a very interesting story within this book. Because we keep coming back to, like when I'm reading, I like gore, I like horror, I like spooky, sexy, evil little vampire creatures biting your neck and skittering into the darkness. I love vampires in that kind of way, but I also really like introspective, interesting, there's more to this than what it seems kind of style of writing. I really like it. I'll probably read it one day, but not out loud, hopefully, because good lord, I hope too many people didn't turn away because it kept going and I kept complaining about it continuing to go. My bad. I'm sorry. I apologize. It's not that bad of a story, actually. Whatever. Now we're on to the very last thing in this book. The poem. Okay. It's called Vampyr by Jane Yolen. The blurb. My only insight about vampires is that they suck, reveals the writer. This poem was written with a melody in my head. I was writing songs for Boiled in Lead at the time, as well as for the Flash Girls and Louis Collins, but the melody has gone away. Okay. I have not heard of any of those things. We stalk the dark, live in the flood, we take the madness in the blood. A moment's prick, a minute's pain, and then we live to love again. Drink the night, rue the day. We hear the beat beneath the breast. We sip the wine that fills the chest. A moment's prick, a minute's pain. Our living is not just in vain. Drink the night, rue the day. We do not shrink from blood's dark feast. We take the man, we leave the beast. A moment's prick, a minute's pain. We live to love, to live again. Drink the night, rue the day. A lovely little ending to our book that has taken us months to read. And it has a little drawing. I don't know how good of a quality this is right now. I had to switch webcams. But little drawing. Yeah, that's horrible. It's so blurry. We finished the book. We finished all 35 stories, including the introduction that we started months ago. Good on us. Thank you for being with me the entire time, if you were, or for popping in and out. I don't care. Thank you if you made it all the way to the end of this video. That's incredible. So much patience. So much more patience than I have. Thank you. I appreciate it. I have more story ideas. I already have a book I'm ready to read. I've been playing with the idea of, I've been playing with a couple ideas. I'll probably just bring them up in the next stream or maybe ask about it in a community post. So look out for that, please. Other than, yay, we finally finished it, I'm out of things to say. Okay, I'm gonna log off, but I will be here next week at Sunday at 6 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, so join me again if you would like to. I, again, very much appreciate it. Thank you so much. Okay, bye-bye.